Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Welcome to the second part of the patch notes discussion. This is going to be a deep dive going through all of the patch notes for 0.3.0 and the Third Edict expansion. This is a monumental task. There are 17,000 words and more in these patch notes, and as a result, I'm breaking it down. Now, my current plans are that this second video is actually not going to be the middle third. It's actually going to kind of be the fourth and fifth sixths, if that makes sense. So basically, if you split this into 6, then video 1 is going to be 1 and 2, video 2 is going to be 4 and 5, and video 3 is going to be parts 3 and 6. There is madness to the method here. I'm doing this split because it just allows me to get things cohesively together, rather than having video 2 end in a really weird spot. The other thing you may notice is that I'm not going to be editing this as tightly as I usually do, just because I am crazy busy at the moment. As a result, there will be more there'll be more ahs, and there'll be more other little mistakes that'll show up in this video. That's just the unfortunate reality of not having an enormous amount of time at the moment. Anyways, we're going to be focusing on the section on skill changes, and it's important to note that the starting lines of this are tremendously important. These are some of the biggest changes in the entire patch, but we don't have exact numbers on them. The base damage scaling of all player skill and secondary damage skills has been tweaked to scale better in the late game. Generally speaking, spells that do not have damage number changes called out below will have near identical base damage at low gem levels, roughly 5% more damage at gem level 20, and roughly 20% more damage at gem level 30. This is something that's going to make plus to gem levels even more important than it was before, and that's going to be a recurring theme when we get to the next line as well. Essentially, gem levels are going to be such a huge part of your character's power that it's going to be absolutely essential to look to get a level 19 version of your gem as soon as you can afford it early in the league, then a level 20 version once you hit level 90. Remember, level 90 is a fairly big milestone. It's not something you'll get to super early usually, but level 84 for level 19 gems is a little bit easier to get to. Then you're going to want to have +7 to gem levels between what's in your two hands. So that's 5 in your main hand, 2 in your offhand usually, or maybe 7 on a staff. That's just for spellcasters. Things are a little bit different for other builds. The other thing is that this makes amulets that have +3 skills on them absolutely mandatory. Other amulets that don't have that, just not consider using them at all. Now that is for spellcasters. If you're playing an attack build, there's a little bit more flexibility there, but you will still find that this is a mandatory stat on more builds than you might think. As for what I think on this, I am definitely not a fan of gem levels being so important. Essentially, I don't like this idea that you have one mod that is so important that it's just better than everything else that can be on that item together. It's kind of like Path of Exile 1, Boots movement speed. The thing is that there's a few alternative ways of getting movement speed on boots in Path of Exile 1. And also, it's kind of only one slot, whereas in Path of Exile 2, you have this issue on a lot of slots. You still have it on boots, because boots without movement speed are just not loot. But then you also have it on weapons, you have it on offhands, you have it on amulets, and then there's a couple of spots where there's uniques that can provide gem levels on them. Those can be extremely, extremely big. One thing I want to call out as a particular beneficiary from this, about middling rarity amongst the uniques, so this is not one of the mythic rare crazy chase uniques, this is something that's a big step down from those, is the unique amulet Fireflower. This is going to be a lot better here. It has a 1 to 4 range on its gem level that it provides to fire skills. It does also have a drawback as well, but that's higher than you can get already, and if you quality this up with Fire Catalyst to 20, and then you get a Miracle Varlorb on it, this can actually roll a 5 on that range of 1 to 4, and then the Catalyst will push it up to 6 as well. So that means that Fireflower is getting better than it was, because this buff is happening to high gem levels is going to be even higher than it was in the past. Additionally, let's double down on everything related to gem levels, shall we? The mana cost of all skills has been rebalanced. However, what this is meaning here, skills will have similar mana costs at low gem levels, potentially slightly higher mana costs at some intermediate gem levels. This is fine, they're not really a problem there. But then lower mana costs, and sometimes dramatically lower, at gem levels higher than 20. So essentially what this is meaning is that the amount of additional investment you need in your character to mana recovery is not going to be as high in order to support those high gem levels. So essentially, where in the past you might have needed to not just get plus 5 to the level of spell skills on your wand, but also mana as well, so that you could afford to pay for that. Now you just need that 5 to the level of skills, and that means that you've got space for more power in those other item slots. However, when you're down at, say, plus 2 on your weapon or plus 3, and you're using a naturally level 17 gem, you're a bit earlier in progression, at that point, it's not really this change is not really going to make a big deal to you. It's going to be later on in progression. So essentially, gem levels and mana cost, the current scaling of them is a little bit broken, but it's not going to work the same way afterwards. Right, this is Editing God popping in to say that I'm pretty much on strike for the rest of this video. There's not going to be much more editing from here on. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, like I said, this was just a monumental task and there's so much to do this week. But also, I haven't been that well earlier this week and I've just had a lot of stuff on in the rest of my life. As a result, I've fallen a lot behind and yeah, sorry, video quality is going to suffer a bit, but this you can consider as a bit of a look behind the scenes as to what it's like when I'm recording a video and I'm not able to delete all the rubbish, all the stream of consciousness thoughts that should probably get deleted. Banners are being completely and utterly redesigned. They no longer have anything to do with Valor. Everything that relates to Valor on the passive tree is being changed. Now there is a unique item that interacts with Valor, both banners and Valor as well. I have to see what they do with that one. But they instead generate glory when you attack enemies. They all require 200 glory to place. Now my reading of this, just based on the way glory tends to work, it's going to be 1, 2, and 5 by default on normal, magic, and rare monsters. It's always 20 on unique monsters, and sometimes normal, magic, and rare monsters will have increased Valor if they're unusually tough. So for instance, you might find that something like Drowning Dead or whatever they're called, those horrible drowning pool zombies, they may end up giving you more than most monsters do. So now, banners are going to tick up this Valor counter until you hit 200. And then, unlike other glory-based skills, banners can gain glory while a banner is placed. All sources of banner valor gained have been replaced with banner glory generated. Now, the key thing we've got here is that with this redesign, banners are going to become something that you charge up while you're doing normal mapping. Then you encounter a tough fight. This could be a fight against one individual monster like a boss, or it could be just one of those screens where there's just a lot of heinous rares in one spot. You drop down your valor. You drop down your banner, and then suddenly you're in a much more powerful position. So that's the intention there of what they're doing, and we'll have to see how it works out. These basically are no longer the same skills. It's like they've gone and deleted every banner skill that existed, and they've added in something else instead. Banners now have a global limit of 1 that's allowed to be placed, but there are ways to break this from the passive tree or the tactician ascendancy. So there's a few things that you can do there. Also, just all the banners stats have been redesigned as well, so they're just a different skill. Now, we have some interesting things here where curse skills and skills that apply elemental exposure now cannot apply these debuffs to enemies that are significantly higher level than the skill's own level requirement. So this means that you're not going to be using a level 1 skill to apply elemental exposure to a monster that is level 80. This requirement is fairly lenient and disappears completely by high gem levels. So essentially, this here is trying to deal with some of the meta that developed in 0.10 and continued into 0.20, where players would be downranking gems. Grinding Gear Games are trying to discourage that, and there's also a much more important change along these lines later when we talk about attribute requirements. The attribute requirements is the big thing that's going to mean you're no longer going to feel the need to downrank your gems, but this is taking away the opportunity to do so as well. Blink, Convalescence, and Sacrifice can no longer be activated in specific weapon sets. They're now required to be active in both weapon sets and will fail to activate if this is not possible. Essentially, this is something that is addressing some things that people did because they were powerful, but didn't necessarily think were particularly fun to do involving weapon swap. Well, we're just removing the ability to do it. If the strongest thing that you can do is not fun, then often the best thing to do is to remove that strongest thing. That's what Grinding Gear Games are doing here. So if you want Blink, you're going to be paying Spirit for it all the time on both weapons. You're not just going to be weapon swapping, blinking around, and then going back. Now, note that this is probably being done by the fact that they're doing the changes to the way that weapon swap works, with it now being absolutely instantaneous. I think previously it was taking like half of your attack time or something like that. There was some sort of timer on it previously. Now that it's instant, this is probably one of the things that's needed in order to make it possible to have it be instant. Higher rarity enemies are now less affected by curses. Curses have 15% less effect on magic monsters, 30% less effect on rare monsters, and 50% less effect on unique monsters. Hold off on this one because there are some changes to curses later as well. And in many cases, I'm not saying this is all cases, but in many cases, there's actually a buff. It means that the curses are going to be better than they were previously on normal magic and rare monsters, and about the same as they were previously on unique monsters. You'll see this for sure when we get to Despair, but I do think that's going to be in the other video possibly. The movement speed penalty inflicted by skills that can be used while moving now begins to fall off slightly more quickly when using the skill. So this means that you will be able to move more. It'll be effectively less of a movement speed penalty to use a skill that you use while moving, because it'll still be the same penalty, but the penalty will end earlier. The spirit cost of spectres has been adjusted such that spectres with high spirit costs are generally cheaper, while some of the cheaper spectres are now more costly. Hey, wasn't there something about spectres of little statue guys from Act 2? Those are probably going to end up being a bit more expensive than they were in the past. And at the same time, some of the bigger things that probably weren't worth summoning at all, they're going to be a little bit better now. Spectres and Tame Beasts now deal 25% more damage at all gem levels. Clearly they weren't worth their spirit cost in the past. Hopefully this makes them worth their spirit cost, but we shall have to see. Instant skills such as Unbound Avatar are now usable while on the roller mount. So this is something that should be a fairly substantial buff to the roller mount. It's something that will make it much more appealing than it's been in the past. Mark skills are no longer spells. That's just a couple of interactions that matters for. And then we have some interesting changes here related to reservation. Now, reservation skills that had reduced reservation with quality, these now have increased reservation efficiency with quality instead. This is something Granny Gear Games learnt from Path of Exile 1, and they're now bringing it to Path of Exile 2. Essentially, one of the problems that came up in Path of Exile 1 was that the original formula that they used for the way that reservation worked in that game, I guess you would say it's the equivalent of Spirit, but the way that it worked in POE1 was that instead of having your own pool for reservations, it would instead tie up a percentage of your mana. So if you'd wanted to use the Anger Aura, if you wanted to use the Aura Anger, that would reduce your maximum mana by 50% for the period that Anger was active. And you would usually just turn it on and then forget about it. Now, you could get something that was called Reduced Mana Reservation. Now, you could get something that originally that was called Reduced Reservation. Now, you could get something that was called Reduced Mana Reservation. RMR is what players tended to call it. And what this did was it was a stat that would just multiply all of those reservations. So if you had 10% RMR, then Anger would go from 50% down to 45%. But this was one of those stats that completely and utterly broke when Granny Gear Games started letting players get more of it. So you would see that going from 80 to 83% RMR was just an absolutely monumental increase in power. And going from 83 to 86 was bigger, 86 to 89 was bigger again, and then you could go from 89 to 92 and start really, really trivializing content. Then they're faced with a situation. Do you make new content that's designed for all of this power that people have got when they're able to run every aura in the game? Or do you instead nerf those outliers and then have them running the content that is currently in endgame? And they decided to go with the former choice. So that was the way that things were done. So that was the problem with the way things were in Path of Exile 1 originally, and they introduced this concept of reservation efficiency. And what that meant was that reserving 100 mana gave you the benefits of reserving 110. Reserving 100 mana with... what this meant was if you had 10% of it, reserving 100 mana would give you the benefits of reserving 110. If you had 100%, reserving 100 mana will give you the benefits of reserving 200 mana instead. And so it was this thing that would allow them to provide additional sources of this stat, this mana reservation efficiency, without completely breaking the game open, because ultimately each 50% of this mana reservation efficiency that you got would typically let you run one additional aura, or of course you could do some other things with it as well. So that is a system that looks like it's coming to POE2 now, and that's probably future-proofing the game. I don't think it's necessarily something that is needed right now, but I think they're going, okay, we want to make it so that we can do more interesting things with Spirit in the future, potentially allow players to get a bit more of it, and that's going to be important to get right now. Okay, so that was a little bit of an aside about how mechanic works in Path of Exile 1 that's being brought to 2. Now we have a number of monk-related things. Killing Palm, Staggering Palm, Shattering Palm, Hand of Chalupa, and Frozen Locust now do damage based upon your equipped Quarterstaff. They no longer have flat added damage or additional critical strike chance. Palm skills can no longer be used without a Quarterstaff equipped by default, and there will be ways to circumvent that requirement in the future. So essentially, these are being changed to be Quarterstaff skills rather than unarmed skills, but there will be ways to use various Quarterstaff skills using just your hands in the future. Shockwave Totem, Ancestral Warrior Totem, Artillery Ballista, Siege Ballista, these now use your equipped weapon or weapons. They no longer have their own flat damage, base crit chance, or base attack time. Now, what we're seeing here is a situation where Grinding Gear Games are saying, right, we want people to invest heavily in a weapon on their character. We want people to feel like any of the strategies that people have got that have come up, most of the strategies people have come up with to circumvent the need to get an endgame weapon, these are mostly getting removed, and instead the reward is being placed in there so that you get yourself a decent weapon. This is also in line with the changes we discussed earlier about what happens with spells exceeding gem level 20 by a long way and how their damage has gone up, their mana cost is going down. They're really making it so that the weapon is cementing itself as the most important slot on every character for their gear And that's going to have a bit of an impact on various items that have utility effects on them that are in the weapon slot. Like, these are just going to feel a bit worse as a result of this change because they're going to be further behind. Some of the alternate things you could potentially do in order to make up for not having a proper weapon are going to effectively be nerfed here. Ancestrally boosted slams are getting buffed a little bit here, but it's not massive. Now, ancestrally boosted slams are getting both a buff and not really a nerf, but a clarification that's going to look like a nerf. So currently they tell you that they have 20% more increased AoE, but they actually have 20% increased AoE. They're going to now have 25% increased AoE, and the game is not going to lie to you about how much increased AoE they have. This is, in many cases, going to make it so that the ancestrally boosted slams, what's always going to be strictly better than it was in 0.10.0.20, but it's going to feel like it's worse because what's actually read on because the game was lying to you previously, and if you didn't realize that, then you thought that it was better than it was then, and you thought that it was better than it's going to be now. Now, we have something about inherent skills that are found on wands and staves. So these are the various spells that you don't get as a gem. Instead, they're built into your wand. They don't cost any mana to cast, and they're all getting buffs, but there's still a little bit of a problem with them. We'll talk on that in a sec. These are going to be gaining a 12% damage buff from skill level 11 and up. And let's talk about the spells themselves first, and then what the problem is. So it is Bone Blast, Chaos Bolt, Decompose, Firebolt, Freezing Shards, Lightning Bolt, Power Siphon, and Solar Orb that are all being affected here. Note that this, I don't think this is quite everything in the game. I could be wrong. There is Mana Drain. I think Mana Drain got a specific call out in here. But here's the problem with these, right? But there is a problem with these things, and that is that they just don't have access to as much scaling as other things do. Currently, the way that gems work, you can get a level 19 one pretty easily once you're in early. So currently the way that real gems work, so ones that you actually equip in your character's gem interface normally, they're not something that's attached to a wand or a staff, you get level 19 ones when your character level 84, but there's something that you'll probably start getting about the time you're level 86 or 87. They're pretty common drops when you're running the highest tiers of maps. Then there's level 20 gems. Level 20 gems are considerably rarer, and these are, I guess, endgame loot in a sense. These are the big drops that you get. You're really happy to see them, although they have been mentioning that in 0.30 they're going to be a bit more common, so you might find that you use 19s for less time and you upgrade to 20s. But, very important but, you can also quality these. Well, you can do that with the staff as well, and you can get them up to 2020 that way, but you can apply a Varlorb to them. And when you apply a Val Orb, one of the outcomes you can get, it requires a bit of luck to get this, and you're also going to need to apply it to a gem that's already 20, 20, and 6 linked. So you've got to apply a Perfect Jeweler's Orb, then you've got to apply 4 GCPs, and then you have a chance with a Val Orb, about 1 in 8 chance, I believe, to then upgrade that gem to level 21. Now that'll actually be an enchantment that's on the gem, and it'll say +1 gem level. However, you don't even need to do this on a level 20 gem. You can pick up a level 19 gem, which is practically free at endgame. You will still need a Perfect Jeweler's Orb it. You will then need to GCP it up, and then you can apply a Val Orb to it, and if and only if it's successful, then you can spend a level 20 gem to upgrade it. So you end up with something that is a 21-20 gem, which is perfect in Path of Exile 2 at the moment. Now, the problem is with the staff, you can get 20-20, but you can't get 21-20. So you're kind of always behind. Additionally, your staff skill is something that, if you build around it, it doesn't use mana, which is a good thing, but it also means it tends to have a slightly lower power budget than a lot of other things would have. Ultimately, you're in a situation there where these things do have their uses occasionally, but they're probably not worth investing really heavily into, because ultimately they're just going to be worse than what you could otherwise get when you're deep into endgame. On top of that, you can get them up to 20-20. You need to use Arcanist Etches instead of Gemcutter's Prisms, but you can definitely get those. They're not that hard to trade for. But then you wind up in this awkward spot where your staff is kind of tight. Then you wind up in this awkward spot where your staff is then also tied to the item mods that are on it as well. And so you don't really want to upgrade your... And so every time that you want to upgrade your staff, you also need to then go through the process of getting it back to... And so every time you want to upgrade your staff, you have to make sure that you get one that's got a suitably high minimum level, or a suitably high level inherent staff skill on it, as well as having really good other mods on it. And on top of that, there's also going to be all of the permanent effects changes that you can apply to a staff. So you can get over quality now, you can get 30 quality on an item just by RNG. You can also get an item that starts out with additional sockets on it. All these sorts of things that can make something permanently better than everything else. But you're going to really need to find all of those on a staff that also has a max level version of your skill. Grinding Gear Games did mention that they are going to make level 20 versions of staves available, but the exact mechanics of how those are going to drop and how available they'll be aren't clear. But the key problem is that you cannot get them to level 21, so you're always a bit behind. And with Grinding Gear Games coming out and then making it so that level 30 spells are going to be even better than they were before by 20%, they're going to fall even further behind. So yeah, this is something I'm not particularly sold on. I think that they probably need more for these inherent skills to be used a lot. They definitely have a place, especially they're good things to drop if you're out of mana, and you know, especially if you've run out of mana flask charges as well, they can let you finish off a fight that you're in trouble on, but they're not some absolute panacea, and they're probably not something I would generally build a character around. Ancestral Warrior Totem. Now, note that this has received some changes to it. The first version of the patch notes had a typo on it. That typo was very different to what exists now, but they've been corrected since. Ancestral Warrior Totem now has no limit. Socketed Mace skills now have 50% less attack speed, now requires consuming 3 endurance charges to raise. So that is a big cost to get an Ancestral Warrior Totem up. You need to be on 3 endurance charges in order to do that. Keep that in mind if you are thinking of using these things. You're going to need to have a lot of endurance charge generation, but in exchange for that, you potentially have quite a bunch of extra damage that's coming from your totem, as well as the damage you're doing yourself. Arc. Arc is completely getting redesigned. It is now a projectile. It no longer causes explosions against shocked enemies. It's no longer a payoff skill. It now chains 6 to 9 times at gem levels 5 to 20, previously 5 to 8, so it's +1 chain over what it used to have. It now has 50% more shock magnitude, and it can consume a lightning infusion to chain additional times and deal more damage. Now deals 2 to 39 damage at gem level 5, which is a slight change from what it used to be, but mostly what they've changed here is not the amount of damage it's doing. They've just changed the balance of how likely you are to roll high or low. It is strictly better than it was. It's like 14% or so better in terms of overall damage, but the main thing they've done is they've shrunk the low end rolls on it, and it scales up to 20 to 386, where previously it was 49 to 277. So that's 203 average damage in the new version of Arc, whereas the old version of Arc, if my maths is right, was doing 163 average damage. So it's quite a bit better. Each step of this is getting quite a bit better, but it's also something that's really changing a bunch. However, very important to note that the quality on it is changing as well. 0 to 10% chance to not remove an infusion, but to still gain the benefits of doing so. Whereas previously, it was granting up to 2% more damage for each additional remaining chain. So you are losing that damage per remaining chain, which was fully refunded in terms of the way they've changed around the numbers on the gem. But ultimately, the big question is, it's a projectile now. Is this just a completely different skill to what exists in Path of Exile 1, where it's very much not a projectile? I haven't played with Arc in POE2, so this is something that it feels like it's an entirely new skill now. This is a very thoroughgoing rework, and ultimately the idea of it being a projectile is interesting. I want to know how fast it propagates. How fast does it propagate, and are the chainings heat-seeking, or are they something where you can end up having the chaining break because a monster causes a physics miss by turning around a corner or something like that? These are some of the things I'd like to see answered on Arc, but ultimately we might not know any of that until the expansion goes live. Archmage. Archmage is something that completely broke the game in 0.10. It was nerfed really hard. It needed the nerf, but it might have been nerfed a little bit too much, and so it's coming back a little bit. So it's still weaker than it was in 0.10, but it's going to be a lot stronger than it was in 0.20. Hopefully this is a sweet spot. If this isn't a sweet spot, then hopefully they experiment with 7 or 9% per 200 maximum mana, or something along those lines, just to find that exact right spot for this skill to be for this skill's power balance to be right. Artillery Ballista, renamed to Siege Ballista, now has a duration of 8 seconds, where previously it was 16, so that's a big decrease. Bolt's attack speed is now 25% of base, and bolts now deal 25 to 66% of attack damage, previously 30 to 79, so everything's looking worse so far. Bolt explosion radius is now 1.4 meters instead of 1.8. Explosion now deals 50 to 132% attack damage, previously 70 to 185. Quality is getting changed a bit from 0 to 0.3 meters to bolt explosion radius, which does not quite get it back to where it was originally, whereas previously it was a totem-based attack time is reducing. So essentially, this is one of those skills. There's a lot of things that are getting buffed here. This is not one of them. This looks like it is really getting slapped around by the nerf bat pretty hard. And ultimately, Artillery Ballista, I don't know how good it's going to be now, but it's not going to be as good as it was last patch, that's for sure. Ball Lightning can now consume a fire infusion to leave a trail of ignited ground and to explode at the end of its travel. This is cool. There's a bunch of these mechanics. So this is something that came up earlier in the first video when we discussed why they were renaming the infusion skill gems to attunements. So Lightning Infusion was renamed to Lightning Attunement, and so on with Cold, Chaos, Fire, and the like. So what's happening here is that when you cast certain spells, you'll have the ability to gain Fire, Lightning, and Cold infusions, and there's also a rework of Elemental Equilibrium, which interacts with this mechanic now. And a bunch of spells are getting little changes that are making it so that they can combo if you're willing to use them as a bit of a resource spender. So you can fire off Ball Lightning just by default if you want, but if you want to fire off an Uber Ball Lightning, then you can feed it a Fire Infusion as well. And when you do that, it's going to have an additional effect. Some of these are going to be fantastic. I will say that Firestorm looks cool. I don't know whether Firestorm is going to be cool or not, but it looks cool. And that's one of the things that really fits into this theme of weaving together multiple elements in order to get different payoffs. One of the things that's going to be tough to balance with that, though, is exactly how it works with gem level boosts that you find on items. For example, if you've got a wand that reads +5 to the level of all lightning skills, well, your ball lightning is going to do pretty good damage. But whatever fire skill it is that you're using to create your fire infusion, it's probably only going to tickle enemies. It's not likely to do any serious damage because essentially you're using a nothing wand for it. You can address this by using your 2 different skill trees and 2 different weapons, and I do think people will do this. But even when you're going down that path, it's going to be the case that you'll more heavily invest in one weapon than the other one, and that's definitely going to cause a bunch of confusion there, and that's definitely going to cause a bunch of difficult choices when you're gearing up. For instance, do I purchase a bad +5 wand, or do I purchase a better +4 fire? For example, do I purchase a good for example, let's say that you've got 40 divines, and option 1 is that you spend 25 divines picking up a really good lightning wand that's +5 to lightning skills and has a bunch of other things, but that upgrades from your +4 to lightning wand. Or your second choice is that you spend that 25 on a fire wand instead. You can't afford to buy both. Which one of them do you trade for? That's going to be something that will be a fairly difficult thing when coming up with builds. And builds in general, you're going to have to keep in mind the ability to swap between weapons quickly. Weapon swapping is going to be pretty much mandatory, I think, in at least on most of the caster builds in 030. Batter Shout getting a damage boost against unique enemies. A lot of things are getting damage boosts against unique enemies, especially if they rely upon removing a status ailment from that unique enemy. So if there's something that says this removes freeze from the target, then it's going to get a huge damage boost against a unique enemy if you do successfully remove a freeze from them. Berserk. Berserk is going to gain considerably more rage effect, but is going to do so at the expense of no longer gaining you any physical attack leech. So this is probably mostly better than it was, but it is going to mean that you will need to invest in leech somewhere on your build, and then Berserk will be better once you've done that. But if you haven't done that, then these changes end up being worse. Bind Spectre. Quality now makes your minions deal more damage instead of providing reduced reservation for them. And again, reduced reservation is generally being changed into reservation efficiency, which is a slightly weaker stat, but you tend to get more of it. But in this case, that quality bonus is just changing entirely. And what they're trying to do here, I think, is make it so that Bind Spectre is better as a damage skill and worse as a utility skill. That seems to be their goal here overall. Blink. Using Blink no longer counts as dodge rolling for the purposes of things that trigger on dodge rolls, like, what's it called, Mirage Archer, the new thing. And it now has a minimum gem level of 8 rather than 14. So Blink is something that you can get access to a little bit earlier than you could before, but it's also not going to interact. It's deliberately excluded from interacting with a few particular mechanics. One thing I want to know with Blink is, does Blink interact with the new sprinting mechanic? And that's something I'm just not sure on at the moment. Bone Offering. This seems to be getting a few buffs here. Spike duration, 8 seconds, previously 5. Explosion radius is going up 20%. Explosion damage is going up by 26-ish%, 25-ish%. So it's going to do quite a chunk more damage. The buff now has minions take 20 to 25% reduced damage from hits while shielded, and now absorbs the first hit dealing over 25% of the minion's maximum life. Quality now causes the shielded minions to take 0 to 30% less damage for 1 second after the shield is lost, instead of having a boost of damage to the explosion. So essentially, this is gaining in some spots, losing in others. I think overall it's a buff. There are definitely some situations in which this is a nerf. Like, this is definitely worse than what it used to be if you're playing it on with extraordinarily high quality. So if you're playing it on a Gemling Legionnaire, then this is definitely worse than it would otherwise be, the 020 version. But that's not usually where it's played. I think in general this is going to be an improvement on what it was before, but not in every situation. Bone Shatter. Shockwave deals 100% more damage against unique enemies. Again, this is that thing. You remove a status effect from a monster, or you inflict one on a monster. Anything that's tied to that is going to be better against unique enemies. Cast on Elemental Ailment is new and is replacing existing Cast on Freeze, Shock, and Ignite. This is now going to require 100 Spirit, minimum level 14, and combines the energy gain conditions of all 3 previous gems. Existing copies of these gems will be updated to cast on elemental ailments when you load the character or stash tab holding them. So this is a fairly substantial change, especially, I can't remember if it was possible still to use 2 of these, and whatever the case, this is now... So this can be a fairly substantial change here. It's basically somewhat of a new gem, and there's also a little bit more support for this trigger setup with elemental ailments that's going to be added. One of the new keystones, I think it was called Ritual Cadence that we discussed in the first video, That's the one that causes it so that there'll be a 2-second cooldown between all of the spells that are detonated from this payload, but they'll also require less to go off. So there's a few things that are going on there where Grinding Gear games are making it so that there's just different setups that are available when it comes to triggering things via elemental ailments. Chaos Bolt, granted by a Withered Wand. So this is one of those wand exclusive skills. This one is now inflicting 1 to 3 stacks of Withered for 4 seconds on hit at all gem levels. I need to check what that was previously, so let's just have a look at that. I don't recall it having that effect on it, but I could be wrong. Yeah, it didn't have that effect at all previously. This is definitely something that's a pretty big improvement over what it used to be. So this is something that I think may now actually find a bit of a home to use. The other thing is that it doesn't really matter that much what your gem level is. You will deal more damage with the Chaos Bolt if it's higher, so you do want it to be level 19, but it's not really critical. If you're wanting to inflict Withered, this is an option for doing so, and it's one that you can fit onto any Chaos build. So yeah, definitely an option to consider. Cluster Grenade. This deals a lot more damage than it used to do. Primary grenade damage is going up by a full 50%. Mini grenade attack damage is going up by a smaller percentage than that. I think that's something like 24% boost. And now it fires exactly 18 mini grenades in a Nova, previously 14. Mini grenades are fired over a wider radius. Essentially, this is just getting buffs all around. This is big buffs, and so this might be something that's worth experimenting with again. Cold Snap. This is now completely reworked. It's a new gem, even though it's got most of the same name. It is now renamed to Snap, though no longer having anything to do with cold. Used on any orb spell or any frozen, shocked, or ignited enemy. It causes an explosion of the corresponding damage type and creates a remnant of the corresponding type from enemies. This explosion can chain react to a limited extent from enemies that are affected by the same element. Now, it deals a chunk of cold damage, lightning damage, or fire damage. Now, it deals a chunk of damage, cold, lightning, or fire, depending upon the elements that are affected, or alternately, depending upon the type of orb that's affected by it. Quality now grants an additional chance to spawn an additional remnant. This is a change from what it used to be, where it was a chance to not consume freeze. Comet is getting buffed. It's a small amount of extra damage, small but meaningful, but it can also be fire infused to deal extra fire damage and to gain base radius. This is the sort of skill, being slow and methodical, this is the sort of thing that is really worth investing one of your fire remnants into, and so Comet is something, definitely keep it in mind as an option. Comet is something that you've got to be very careful with because it is a long cast time. It's something that takes a bunch of messing around to get going, but if you can get it off in a spell, it does a lot of damage. So keep it in mind. It's an option. It's definitely not the right option for every situation, but it's something that is worth considering in your arsenal because in Path of Exile 2, you can have a bunch of 5 or 6 link spells, and as long as they've got a niche somewhere, they're worth having. Contagion. Quality now provides contagion targets 0 to 2 additional enemies when cast, instead of a max. Contagion, I feel I really need to play around with in order to understand better exactly what this is doing. So it's providing a bunch of a bonus when it is cast. It's now going to hit additional monsters when you cast it, and this is replacing the previous effect, which was maximum damage debuff bonus that was able to spread. I think this is probably a bit of a nerf to the skill, but I've got to test that out, and so yeah, basically got to play with that to know for certain. Defiance Banner, completely redesigned. Remember we had all those things earlier when we were talking about how it's going to use the Valor system instead of the old system, nothing related to Glory or... Defiance Banner, completely and utterly redesigned. No longer does anything to do with Valor, instead it's got to do with Glory. You gain Glory just by hitting enemies. The tougher the enemy is, the more Glory you gain. And the aura now grants 30% more armor and evasion rating. This is massively more than you used to get. It used to be 6 to 9%. 30% increased movement speed. Previously it was only 5%. Now has a duration of 9.8 seconds at the top end, and the banner is no longer removed when you leave the aura. So this is fantastic if you're fighting a boss and you recognize that there is a dangerous spot coming up. Well, you can drop down your Defiance Banner and you're now harder to hurt because you've got your armor and evasion rating, but you're also much more able to dodge anything they're doing. And especially for moments in fights like the Arbiter of Ashes dancing phase that you've got to dodge around, that extra movement speed could potentially be really good there. Quality grants you reservation efficiency. and basically this feels like it's got potential. The key thing is we've just got to see how this new glory system actually feels in practice on banners, and that's going to give us an answer. Hey, we mentioned earlier that curses were getting some universal nerfs, but then this is being refunded on the actual curses power itself. So Despair, this is getting its effect roughly doubled in power from what it used to be. It's actually slightly better than doubled, but you're losing half of this when you're cursing a unique enemy. So unique enemies, it only applies at 50%, rare 70%, and magic it is 85%, normal monsters 100%. All in all, Despair is getting strictly buffed, but the buff is tiny when you're using it on a unique monster, and the buff is very, very, very substantial indeed when you're using it on something of lower rarity. Disengage. Quality now provides a chance for an additional shockwave instead of CDR on the gem. Dread Banner. Aura is now granting half a blast charge per second, previously 1 per 6 seconds, it's now 1 per 2. 60% more elemental element threshold, previously a lot less, and now also grants 4% max reses. It no longer provides more stun threshold. Now has a duration that's almost 10 seconds at gem level 20, previously almost 7, and the banner is no longer removed when you leave the aura. However, of course, just like all of the other banners, it is going to have a bunch more stuffing around in order to get it to work. Earthquake comes next. Jagged Grounds radius is now getting a substantial nerf, 220 centimeters down to 180. Aftershock now is doing more damage than it used to do though, so that's going up by something of the order 20% at the top gem levels, but less than 20% at low gem levels. And it has a radius of 2.4 meters to 3 meters at gem levels 1 to 20, previously 3.4 at all gem levels. So essentially, your Earthquake hits harder and it hits a smaller area of the screen. It's kind of like if you were using Path of Exile 1's concentrated effect. If that got baked into a skill, it's like that effect. It's kind of like if you were forced to take on some of the aspects of Path of Exile 1's concentrated effect support, which causes a skill to do more damage, but also causes it to affect less area. It's like that's been baked into Earthquake here. This is probably going to be a better skill gem overall, but it's not going to be better in every situation, and there will be definitely people who find that this is worse than it was. Earth Shatter quality now provides 0 to 6% more damage with hits for each spike, instead of 0 to 3 maximum spikes. Detonation now also triggers existing spikes. So, something that needs to be said here comes up a bunch with these quality effects. When it says quality provides 0 to 6, I probably should have said this at the start. What that means is that it scales linearly from 0 at quality of 0 up to 6 at quality of 20. So this means basically 0.3% per quality, but the rounding on that may not quite work exactly the way you think. So it might be that it's 0% more damage with hits per each spike at qualities of 0, 1, 2, 3, and then once you tick over to 4, then it starts rounding down to 1. Of course, with the way that GCPs work in Path of Exile 2, you're pretty much never going to have a quality that is not 0, 5, 10, 15, or 20. Anyways, Earth Shatter is going to get more damage at the expense of damage projection. It is probably a worse skill now after this, but I'm not 100% certain on that. Electrocuting Arrow, no longer a movement skill, and now shoots an arrow forward that explodes, applying its electrocuting rod to all enemies hit. Quality now causes hits against targets with attached rods to gain 0 to 10% of damage as extra lightning damage. Previously, arrow duration is 0 to 6 seconds. Elemental Sundering. Pulse can now consume up to 20 elements, previously 9. Cold Explosion now deals 40% more damage. The Cold now also deals 100% bonus damage against unique enemies. Again, we have this sort of thing that's coming up again and again, where anything that is consuming an ailment from an enemy is giving you an additional payoff for consuming them from unique enemies. Ember Fusillade. This can now be infused with lightning to cause each ember in an entire fusillade to create a beam that chains lightning damage to enemies. So this sounds like it could go as give this a way to project damage to multiple targets. The infusion is consumed when the fusillade fires all embers in that fusillade, and now has a minimum gem level of 9. So this is no longer going to be a super early game skill. This is something that you'll get, I think level 9 is very end of Act 2, rather than being something that you got in the middle of Act 1. Emergency Reload. This now reloads all your crossbow ammunition. Emergency reload now reloads all of your crossbow ammunition clips previously just affected your most recent, and it empowers each clip's ammunition to deal increased damage for its duration, or until you expend all of your empowered bolts. Now has number of each clip's empowered bolts is equal to the maximum ammunition of the clip. So basically, this is getting quite a number of boosts here, and should end up being quite a bit better than it was. Enfeeble is next. Now, Enfeeble is an interesting one in that Enfeeble is basically almost exactly as good as it was before. It's actually getting a very small nerf against the unique targets. It's getting a small nerf against the very weakest of monsters, but against rare monsters and against magic monsters, it's going to be slightly better than it was, I think. But this is basically going to do the same thing it used to do, but it's just scaling differently because of the changes that are being made to curses. Curse now makes targets deal 21 to 29% less damage at gem levels 3 to 20, and this is something that has that weird sort of scaling that we were talking about when it comes to all of the curses in the game. Escape Shot now creates ice fragments in its area of effect. This looked quite a lot better when Grinding Gear Games actually demonstrated this one a little bit in some gameplay footage. These fragments explode after a short duration to deal additional damage. Additionally, it now causes you to travel 6 meters back, previously 4.5 meters. So essentially, it's better at what it does in multiple ways. Firstly, it's going to be more powerful offensively, and secondly, more powerful defensively in causing you to get away. Now, the big test with Escape Shot. How effective is it as a movement skill? Is it something that you could conceivably fire up on a bow just to use because all you want is that 6 meters of backwards movement? So you then you're running through a zone and you fire a shot behind you in order to make Escape Shot cause you to move at faster than 100% of your normal movement speed. That I don't know. That is going to require a bit of messing around. Explosive Spear. This is getting a buffed. When you feed it a frenzy charge, then you will get 8 seconds of ignited ground rather than 4 seconds. This was already a reasonably good skill. It got completely and utterly eclipsed by the fact that Lightning Spear was so busted in 020, and especially by the fact that Vault Support was so synergistic with Lightning Spear as well as so busted. But Explosive Spear should be on your radar if you like the Spear playstyle. Eye of Winter. When passing through an allied flame wall, the eye itself and now all the shards it subsequently released will receive the flame wall's added fire damage. So essentially, another one of those things where the game is creating a combo, creating things that you can do together, but it doesn't look like you need to. These two skills should probably both work okay by themselves or in conjunction with other things like Spark, for instance, for Flame Wall, but this is just a new option that's there. If you like Eye of Winter, then this is a thing that you can potentially do with it. Fangs of Frost. Explosion now causes 150% more freeze buildup at gem level 1, and it now gains 9% more per level, previously 6%. So basically, the freeze component of this is going to be much better than it was. Quality now provides a 0 to 15% chance to not consume the parry debuff, instead of 0 to 4 to melee strike range. All in all, I think there's a bunch of things that are going on here where things that were unpopular on the Huntress are generally receiving buffs. Things that were popular, things that were too good on the Huntress are definitely getting nerfed, but things that were just unpopular, they seem to be getting a little bit of a boost. Now, poor Fireball. Fireball is getting reimagined a bit as a more basic skill. I will miss the old Fireball. The secondary Fireball projectiles were just cool. I thought that it was one of the coolest imaginings of what a Fireball looks like in a video game. But this is what we've got now. No longer creates secondary Firebolt projectiles by default. Instead, it can consume a fire infusion to do so. Now has a minimum gem level of 3, previously 9. Primary projectile and explosion now deal a certain amount of damage, scaling up to quite a bit more damage than it used to do. So 240 to 362 at level 20, whereas previously you were turning 135 to 202. It's kind of difficult to compare that to Gem Level 3 because Gem Level 3 did exist in the game files. Like GGG's formulas could regress to Level 3, but players couldn't access it to 9, so we don't know if it was good or not. But the damage is going up by 80% there. Secondary projectiles, which you do not get by default anymore, they are now going to scale up to a massive amount. 606 damage, up from 218 in the past. So if you feed it a fire infusion, it's going to be much better than it was. But if you don't feed it a fire infusion, then you're not going to get these secondary projectiles at all. Secondary projectiles can now hit the same target as the primary projectile. All in all, Fireball is getting somewhat of a reimagining. I don't know how easy it's going to be to generate these fire infusions. If you can generate fire infusions reasonably easily, then Fireball is going to be a magnificent skill to use. However, if it is not possible to do that easily, then this could end up being completely DOA. And it was a fun skill previously, so I hope they've gotten this right, but it's one of those things that I don't think we can say for certain until we get to play with it. Firestorm now has a base radius of 2.8 meters, down from 5.6, so this is getting a massive contraction. This is no longer hitting the whole screen, instead it's hitting a localized area. Now it creates 1 bolt every 200 milliseconds, down from 1 every 100. Nerf from 1 every 100. No longer consumes Ignite to create improved bolts, instead it can consume every type of elemental infusion. Now if you feed it a fire infusion, it doubles in size, which is just bringing it back to what it was previously, and it creates 3 times as many bolts, which is making it better than it was previously. Cold and lightning infusions cause the storm to deal additional... Cold and lightning infusions cause the storm to create additional cold and lightning bolts respectively. 1 of each infusion can be consumed by a single use of the skill. Firebolt damage is now going to be quite a bit less than it was. Ultimately, Firestorm is not doing it. Firestorm is not doing it for me here. This feels like it's quite a bit worse than it was, at least based on a first rating. I'm open to being proven wrong on this, but this is not one of the skills that's leaving me excited to try it. Whereas something like Fireball, it's different, it's worse in some situations, but at least it's got some cool things going for it. It's just something that's intriguing. Flame Wall can now consume a lightning infusion in order to grant additional lightning damage to projectiles that pass through it, as well as doing the fire damage like it normally does. Unfortunately, it no longer causes projectiles that pass through it to ignite enemies. It now deals a certain amount of fire damage to enemies that are inside the wall, and it ignites as though dealing a certain amount of damage, which is quite a bit less than it was, and it now has a base critical strike chance as well. So essentially, this spell is getting changed a lot in its identity, but it's not really what it used to be. It's simply doing different things, and it's going to take playing with this to get a bit of a sense as to whether it's any good or not. Right, so next up we have the consolidation of flammability, conductivity, and hypothermia. In theory, this is potentially a buff, as it means that now you can actually use different types of elements together quite effectively, but in practice, we don't have the numbers on the new elemental weakness gem, and as a result, I'm unwilling to call this a buff, a nerf, or anything in between. We're going to find this one out once we get gem numbers. We don't have gem numbers yet, and so we don't really know what's going on. Now, Flicker Strike. This is something that was not in the first release of the patch notes. It was added later. Quality now provides more damage per power charge consumed instead of 0 to 20% chance to not remove charges on use. This is one of many changes that are being made that relate to changing the effective quality to be something that becomes a bit less scalable, to be something that doesn't quite have the same level of escalating returns that it would otherwise have had. So, one of the things I think Grinding Gear games are going for here is that they want quality to be a stat that you can scale quite high, and not just to the 20% that's found on the gem, and maybe a little bit more if you're a Gemling Legionnaire, but they're definitely providing 5% to all quality gems on the passive tree. That's going to be a notable. People can anoint it even if they're not anywhere near that spot on the tree, and there's probably going to be other sources as well. And this is just going to be a new scaling axis. As a result, they don't want to have a situation where the 50th point of quality is much more valuable than the 40th, or more problematically with something like the old Flicker Strike quality, the 100th point of quality ends up being worth more than the first 99 all put together. That's what it looks like they're going for here, putting a limit on just how high quality can scale. If you weren't scaling quality into the stratosphere, this is not really a negative change at all, but if you are scaling it into the stratosphere, this is quite negative. Now, fragmentation rounds are next. Explosion from frozen enemies now converts all fizz damage into cold, and will now cause further explosions on any frozen enemies it hits, although this cannot propagate any further. So basically, you hit the first enemies, they cause their explosion to go off, that explosion can detonate other frozen enemies, but there's no further propagation of this chain reaction. You're not seeing something that can go across multiple screens with this, but you will see something that expands quite a bit further beyond the original limits. Explosion radius is now 2 meters, scaling up from 1.8. Hits against frozen enemies now have 50% more damage against unique enemies. This is something that's commonly here. We're seeing again, those payoffs for freezing enemies, those payoffs for stunning enemies, they're larger on unique enemies. Now, One thing here that's coming up quite a bit as well, this conversion of physical into cold damage being 100%, it seems like we're getting more sources of 100% conversion than we used to have. And that's something that's useful because it means that you can scale things a bit more reliably. Partial conversion is a bit dubious in Path of Exile 2, and as a result, the way that conversion works in this game, it's just going to be better to have more of a... With the way that conversion works in Path of Exile 2, partial conversion is just not so valuable. You definitely want full conversion where it's available, because then you can focus entirely upon scaling the final outcome of the damage type. Remember, in Path of Exile 1, if you've got cold damage and you convert it into fire, then things that increase cold damage and things that increase fire damage both work on it. In Path of Exile 2, only things that increase the fire damage component will end up working on it. That's a big change in systems, and it means that they can do different things with conversion, things they couldn't do in 1, but it also means there are some limits on it. Now, Frostbomb, this is getting some major numbers changes and just major mechanics changes as well. So, now deals 7 to 11 cold damage at gem level 1, previously 16 to 23, so that's a 50% nerf, scaling up to 238 to 538 at gem level 20, which was previously 467 to 701. This one's a bit of an oddball. It's not exactly a 25 or 50% nerf. It's 50% in some spots, but 25% in others. I'm just going to call that about a 35% nerf overall. Now it has a cooldown of 6 seconds, previously 3.5. Again, ouch. But while this is all sounding like terrible news so far, there is something that's going to improve later. So it now has a 4-second detonation time instead of a 3-second duration before exploding, which again is bad news. It now chills enemies as though dealing 300% more damage, and it applies universal elemental exposure, not just single exposure to cold. It initially applies 20% elemental exposure and 2% per pulse, up to a cap of 50%. Quality now provides 0 to 10% more elemental exposure applied, whereas previously it was cold exposure effect. So, Frostbomb, when it is used as a damage skill, is massively worse than it used to be. Frostbomb, when it is used as a debuff, is probably a bit better than it used to be. Ultimately, this is just a changed gem. You're not going to want to use it in the same situations you used to want to use it in. You're going to want to use it in different ones. Frostwall. This is getting a nerf to a whole bunch of abuse cases. If you are just using Frostwall as a wall, then this is a nothing change. If you were using it, however, in some of the more powerful and degenerate ways, then sorry, your hopes and dreams have been ruined. Now deals 80% less damage in the first 500 milliseconds of its duration. This is going to outright kill some of the builds that were causing a bunch of problems. Frostball in the past has been responsible for Trample Toe needing to be nerfed, and this ultimately is just another shot that's being fired into that archetype. Frostwall, however, is still going to be fine for a bunch of uses, but I don't think any of the builds that have been using it that have been really high-end are still going to continue to do so. Frostbolt. Base projectile speed has been lowered 20%, no longer leaves chilled ground as it travels. Instead, it chills as though dealing 100 to 195% more damage. Projectile now deals quite a bit less cold damage than it used to do, and this change does not affect the explosion. Okay, so here we're looking at Frostbolt and saying, this is mostly worse than it used to be, not worse in every situation. There's definitely situations in which this is better, but I feel like this is becoming more of a combo skill than it used to be. It's still potentially usable as a single skill occasionally, but most of the time, I think you're going to want to do something else with it. Frozen Locust, again, here we've got something where things in the first 500 milliseconds of their duration are going to be weaker. Galvanic Shards. Ammunition no longer has 50% or less reload speed and now has 1 bolt loaded per clip, previously 5. Combined, that is a nerf. Projectile attack damage is now being raised quite a bit. 21 to 54% at gem level 5, previously 21 to 54% depending on gem level. Previously it was 14 to 31%, so this is a pretty significant buff there. While beam attack damage is 107 to 272%, which is another big increase. This is something like a 40% increase, maybe more than 40% on what it was previously. It now fires 8 fragments per shot, previously 6, and has a mana cost that is considerably lower than it used to be. Quality now fires 0 to 2 fragments per shot instead of 0 to 2 bolts loaded per clip. What we're looking at here is this becoming much more of a big event to use. Galvanic Shards is now going to take more setup to use, but then when you set it up and you fire it off, it's going to be more impactful than it used to be. It's dealing a lot more damage than it used to do, but if you just stand still and keep firing it over and over, it's probably going to end up doing about the same amount of damage overall because you're going to be firing off left shots. However, if you are using some of that time that you're reloading to do other things, then you might find this is particularly good. There are also a number of things that let you reload whilst doing other things. One of the new lineage supports, for instance, comes to mind here as something that you might want to consider there. Gas Grenade no longer has unusual behavior, causing it to detonate as soon as it stops bouncing. Instead, it strictly obeys its detonation time, like other grenades. I feel like this is mostly going to be a nerf, but there might be the odd occasional situation where the extra control is worth your while. Glacial Bolt. Ice crystals now have 50% more area of effect if shattered, and they deal 80% less damage in the first 500 milliseconds of their duration. Oh look, we have a bit of a pattern emerging here. All sorts of ice conjurables are getting this deals 80% less damage in the first 500 milliseconds of their duration. Ultimately, the more control you've got over where enemies are, the better these effects are going to be. Glacial Cascade no longer consumes freeze on enemies to deal 350% more damage. It now consumes freeze on non-unique enemies to deal a smaller amount more damage, and consumes freeze on unique enemies to deal a larger amount more damage, 500%, which is quite a lot. Burst radius is larger, final burst radius is now quite a bit larger, and quality is now better than it used to be as well. What are we looking at here overall? I think we're looking at a skill that is more of a payoff. It's still going to work in the situations that it worked in before, but it's just going to feel a lot better when it's used against unique enemies. I do feel, however, this is going to be quite a bit worse when used against the tankiest of tanky rares. This situation is going to be pretty disappointing in, whereas against other sorts of monsters, it's going to feel better, particularly against unique monsters. Against the weakest of monsters, it's probably actually enough damage. So if you can inflict freeze on a normal rarity or even a magic rarity monster, the nerf from 350% more damage to 150% more damage probably isn't all that impactful because you've already inflicted a freeze on them. They're probably going to die very soon. It is really going to be a nerf against rares, but also at the same time a buff against unique enemies. I'm going to call this a slight winner overall, although I don't think it's going to be a winner for everyone. Hailstorm rounds. Bolts now fire in an expanding circle rather than overlapping with each other. Now has an impact radius of 1 meter, nerfed from 1.2, and a rain radius of 4 meters, buffed. Now this is a change from 2.5. I'm not going to call this a buff, I'm not going to call it a nerf, because it's one of those things where you're going to get less overlap, but you're also going to get more coverage. One bolt now falls every 100 milliseconds, previously 300, and there is no longer a minimum distance the bolts can land from the firing location. This, however, is a huge buff here. Now it deals more damage than it used to do as well, and the ammunition has more reload speed as well. All in all, I think this is looking a lot better than it used to be. A lot better. I really need to see this in game though to be certain. All the numbers here indicate that it's quite a lot better, even though you're now firing out your projectiles over a larger radius, which does mean more of them will miss a given enemy. You are now firing so many more projectiles that it's likely to make up for that. New skill. New change, Hand of Chayula. Quality now provides 0 to 20% increased duration of socketed gems, instead of supported curses have 0 to 10% increased magnitude. It still also provides bonus effect. It still also provides increased effect of socketed marks. I feel like this is worse than what was previously outlined here. Herald of Thunder. Bolt impact radius is getting a nerf. This should probably surprise no one. This was very, very strong. Hex Blast. Quality now provides 0 to 10% more damage per 1 second of remaining duration of removed curse, instead of being 0 to 20% more chaos damage. This is almost always going to be a buff and a pretty considerable one, but it's still something that is such a clunky skill that I think this is going to be very fringe still. It does something powerful, it does something very explosively powerful, but it does so with so much clunk that I think that a large majority of players won't be interested in using it. High velocity rounds no longer consumes fully broken armor. Instead, hitting a fully armor broken enemy will apply a debuff to that enemy, which causes your attack hits against that enemy to deal additional physical damage equal to 5% of the physical damage dealt by the high velocity round that applied the debuff. This one's interesting. This is a payoff for critting when the enemy has fully broken armor. If you can manage that, then you're going to get a whole bunch of extra damage on that enemy, especially if you can follow up with lots of small, sharp, staccato bursts of damage. So there's a lot of potential for this to be good. And ultimately, I think this is just all around better anyway. It's doing something that's a little bit different, but it's definitely doing something that's really strong. Ice Nova, this can eat one of your cold infusions to deal more damage and to create an area of chilled ground. This, like so many other of these infusion things, will live or die based upon its raw numbers and also based upon how reliably we can get these cold infusions. If they're really hard to get, then this skill is DOA. If they're reasonably easy to get, then this skill will be seeing quite a lot of extra use here. Ice Shards. These shards now deal a lot more damage. This is 29 to 82%, previously 12 to 33%. So this is something like double and a half damage. But there's a bunch of other changes here. They arm after 1.5 seconds. They now deal up to 300% more damage after arming. They now deal 80% less damage in the first 500 milliseconds of their duration. They no longer deal 700% more damage after 500 milliseconds. So this is a lot of messing around in order to basically give and take and basically do pretty much nothing with the text that we've seen so far. So you're losing a factor of 8 here, and it's just a whole lot of changes that are being made that don't really end up doing a whole bunch. Ultimately, you're still doing roughly the same amount of total damage. Now, your projectile now deals 11 to 29% of attack damage at gem levels 5 to 20. This is a slight nerf. Now has an arming time before which it will not explode, even if shot directly under an enemy. Quality now provides shards chill enemies as though dealing 0 to 100% more damage. Instead of shards that have existed for at least 500 milliseconds, now deal 0 to 200% more damage. Now, what we've got here is just a whole bunch of reworking of where all these little bonuses are. The maths reasonably end up coming out the maths on this comes out pretty similar, so it's not like there's been a lot of real changes. It's just that it's just a lot of things have been entirely reworked here. Incendiary Shot now has ignites you inflict with this skill at 200% faster, and also now has 30% increased ignite duration for each pellet that hits a target. Now inflicts 300% more flammability, previously a 100%. Now, when we're talking about flammability here, that is a new mechanic, just the way that all of the ignite stuff is working. So it's not really any exact comparison to say that it's the same as it used to be. It's a little bit different. Quality now provides 0 to 15% increased ignite duration for each fragment that hits a target, instead of 0 to 20% increased ignite magnitude. So the big deal here is that you've got this 200% faster. I don't think this had that stat before, and ultimately that means that this is quite a lot better than it used to be. Okay, so next up we have Incinerate, and this is an entirely new skill here. Ultimately, this one's very hard to assess until people have had a chance to play with it. This is not able to be used as a sole skill at all. And that's because the resource that you use to cast it is no longer going to be mana, it's going to be fuel. How do you get fuel? By having an Incinerate gem equipped to your character, and then by casting other spells. So it requires fuel that is gained by spending mana to use. No longer has a mana cost itself, no longer applies fire exposure. Its cast speed is now fixed, and it gains a stage every 250 milliseconds. Cone length is now 5.8 meters, up from a previous 4.6. It now has 12 maximum stages, previously 8. No longer creates burning ground by default. Instead, you can feed it a fire infusion to cause it to create ignited ground. This will have a radius of 140 centimeters, previously 80. Its minimum gem level is now 13, so this is being removed, this is being repositioned, redesigned as a very high rank finisher skill, previously 5. Beam now has 50% less ignite duration, previously 25%, and deals 30% more damage per stage instead of 40%. The beam now ignites as though dealing 520 damage at level 20. The beam now ignites as though dealing a 190 to 519 to 285 to 778 fire damage at gem levels 13 to 20. So let's just focus on gem level 20 there. It's going to be 519 to 778, whereas previously it was 314 to 470. So essentially all the numbers on this are much better, but there's a lot more convoluted hoops to jump through. Note that you need to be spending mana to use this, so anything that lets you circumvent mana skills does not appear to work, but there's going to be a whole bunch of ways that you can get payoff here, and I think this will be something that will be useful in conjunction with a number of things. Ultimately, though, it's going to be something that you can't use all the time. You use one spell, then you swap over to Incinerate for a little while. The big question here, how long does fuel last? Can you get a whole bunch of mana that you spend and then save that up, sort of throughout an entire map, and then dump a whole map's worth of fuel on the boss? I assume you can't do that, but we don't know what the limitations are that would prevent you from doing so. So that is Incinerate. Very much a different skill entirely, and one that we can't judge yet. Could be interesting, it could be terrible. We lack the information to confirm. Infernal Cry. This now empowers 1 attack per 10 enemy power in range. Note that the way that power works in Path of Exile 2, you always count as 20 for a unique monster, but then it is 5 for rare monsters by default, 2 for magic, 1 for normal, and this scales up if those monsters are unusually tough. Now this counts up to a maximum of 50 power, previously 1 attack plus an additional attack per endurance charge consumed. It no longer has 38% increased Warcry speed, while empowered attacks gain 32 to 49% of damage as fire damage. Previously 5% of power per enemy. Previously 5% per 5 power of enemies in range, up to 100%. Infernal Cry's Combust now deals 6 to 9 to 112 to 167 fire damage at gem levels 3 to 20, and this was previously 11 to 17 to 120 to 180, so it's a little bit lower than it used to be, though it now deals significantly more damage at gem levels past 20. Now allows you to expend an endurance charge to bypass the cooldown rather than consuming endurance charges to empower additional attacks. Quality now provides empowered attacks gain 0 to 10% of fire damages extra fire damage, whereas previously it was doing that, but that was conditional upon power of enemies in range and could go considerably higher. Ultimately, this is looking worse than it used to be, but it's also looking quite a bit different, and it's going to be one of those things that, again, kind of doesn't fit the builds that it used to fit anymore. Now it fits new things, just something quite different to what it used to be. Killing Palm, this is now gaining more power charges than it used to, not when you're dealing with normal and magic monsters, but only when you're culling things that are a bit tougher. Lightning Bolt. Now this is not something you can get by default. This comes from the Choir of the Storm unique amulet, and Choir of the Storm unique amulet has a very high opportunity cost because you can't use a +3 skills amulet in its place. This is now correctly typed as a triggered skill. This means it will scale off increases and reductions to triggered skill damage, as well as to other similar stats, and means it will no longer be capable of generating energy to trigger other skills. So here, what they're looking to do is make it so that there's not so many spell loops as Path of Exile 1 has sort of developed over the years. There's a bunch of things that you can do in POE1 that can cause spellcast loops. You automatically cast A automatically triggers B automatically triggers C automatically triggers A. It looks like they're trying to prevent that sort of thing from happening in Path of Exile 2 at the moment, and that's one of the goals they're going for here. This amulet was something that really did break the game at a couple of points, and particularly in conjunction with Legacy Temporalis and the old way that Blink worked, but nowadays I think it's much more tame than it was, and ultimately it's probably not going to be causing any problems in the foreseeable future. As for using this in non-degenerate setups, I'm not really sold on it just because of the massive opportunity cost of not having +3 to level of skills found on your amulet. Lightning Conduit no longer consumes shocks from targets that are hit, but now has a 6-second cooldown. Ouch. Now deals a very much larger amount of damage, 69 to 208 damage at gem level 13, previously 41 to 123, so we're looking at something like 75% more there. Scaling up to, again, something like 75-80% more damage than it used to do at gem level 20. Now has 2 additional bolts if a shocked enemy is in the target area. Previously, 1 to 4 additional bolts hit targets if at least 1 shock was consumed. Now the quality now provides 0 to 5% more damage with hits per 5% of shock effect on enemy, instead of a 0 to 20% chance on consuming a shock on an enemy to reapply it. Broadly speaking, every time you cast Lightning Conduit, it's going to be better than it used to be. The problem is, with a 6-second cooldown, you're not going to be casting it all that often. This is something that is now better as a secondary skill than it used to be, and is less usable as a primary skill. Save this one for emergencies, save it for the tankiest of enemies, save it for big things. Don't expect to be full clearing using only Lightning Conduit. Now, very minor changes to Lightning Rod here. This is just gaining a different quality bonus. Not really better or worse than it used to be, maybe a little bit worse. Next up though, we have Lightning Spear. Our Lightning Spear is getting a very substantial nerf after how absolutely overwhelming it was in 0.2.0. Now, this is not the only change to Lightning Spear. It's worth saying, Tangle Tongue, the unique spear, that is getting a really substantial nerf. Tangle Tongue is going from an S tier weapon to, I feel like it's a B tier weapon. I feel like this is nerfing something from, if you take Path of Exile 1 as an example, a little bit better than Divinarius, down to being Cold Iron Point. It's still good, but it's no longer just miles past everything else in the game. However, on top of that, the fact that it is losing the ability to deal more damage when consuming a frenzy charge, this is a really, really substantial change. The last thing though that we're missing here is what's happening to Vault support, because all of the support gems are pretty much missing from the patch notes at the moment, and those are going to have a monumental suite of changes. One support gem was responsible for 0.2.0 being Lightning Spear League. Everyone referred to it as Lightning Spear League, but really it was Vault Support League. And ultimately, Vault Support was simply delivered a little bit better with Lightning Spear than any other spear gem. Well, I'm expecting Vault Support is going to be kind of taken out the back and shot. And if that happens, Lightning Spear would probably go from an S+ tier skill down to an A tier skill anyway. Then you add in the Tangle Tongue nerf, and now it's an A- skill. Add in the loss of the ability to deal more damage when consuming a frenzy charge, and suddenly maybe you're not talking an A- tier skill, maybe you're talking a B tier skill instead. Personally, I will not miss Lightning Spear. I will not miss the play Lightning Spear or don't bother meta that we had in 0.2.0. Even though Lightning Spear was a fun skill, it did have some cool things with it, I won't miss it being absolutely everywhere. Living Bomb and Solar Orb have swapped places. One of these is now available at the same gem level as the other one used to be, and the other one is now on staves. So Living Bomb is now going to be a level 5 elemental skill gem, and Solar Orb is now an inherent skill that is tied to the Pyrophyte staves. Existing items are not affected by this change, so that's something where existing items are just going to change quite a bit there. Living Bomb no longer explodes at the end of its duration. Instead, it explodes upon dealing sufficient damage to the enemy or upon outright slaying it. Now, here's something interesting. This is a reliable source of fire infusion remnants. Upon the enemy exploding, you're going to get yourself one of these things, or at least it's going to drop the corpse of the enemy. It now has a base duration of 5 seconds, previously 2500 milliseconds. Now has a base crit chance of 7%, nerfed from 9%. Explosion is now dealing comparable damage to what it used to at low gem level, but more damage than it used to at high gem level. Now, the other thing to note, of course, Living Bomb now being something that is an actual skill gem, rather than being something that is tied to a particular staff type, this means that it's going to be a little bit more available than it used to be. Staves was something that could be a bit tricky. Firstly, in 0.2.0, you just could not get level 20 versions of any of these staves. You could not get one because there's no sources of minimum level 90 equipment in the game. Now, that may not be the case in 0.3.0, sorry. Granny Gear Games have mentioned they are making it so that staves can drop with gem level 20 spells on them, but you're not going to be able to get level 21 on them in any case. And on top of that, it's also one of those things where you've got to get everything together in the one package. You don't just need to get the staff, you also need to get that staff with all of the mods that would make it into a good item. And that's going to be hard to do, and as a result, it's quite a bit of an improvement for Living Bomb, having it be available discreetly from the staff. On the drawback side though, Solar Orb is now being tied to the staff. That's going to make it a lot harder to use Solar Orb effectively. And now we come to Magma Barrier. We could discuss Magma Barrier at length on its own, but Magma Barrier is intimately tied up with something else that's found in the patch notes, and these are the fundamental changes to the mechanic that is block. Blocking is no longer limited to strikes and projectiles by default. All hits that are not explicitly marked as unblockable, i.e. they have the red flash associated with them, they can now be blocked. However, at the same time, player, minion, and monster base maximum block chance has been nerfed down to 50% from 75%. So what we've got here is a situation where all of the mechanics related to block are up in the air. And it's in this context that Magma Barrier is receiving some changes. Now this is going to passively increase your chance to block while active. Over time, it's going to charge up with lava. When it's fully charged, your next block that you execute with your shield raised will spray lava in front of you and will grant you an endurance charge. Now this is going to grant 25% increased block chance. Magma Spray now has a certain amount of damage that's added based upon the evasion rating of your shield, and this is a fairly generous amount if you're using an all evasion rating shield, and it has a radius of 280 centimeters. It now deals an amount of base damage that is a bit worse than it used to be. 103 to 155 base offhand fire damage at maximum gem level, or at least gem level 20. Previously, this was 177 to 265, and 684% attack damage. Previously, 471%. So you see how it scales more with your equipment and less with gem levels than it used to. Quality now provides 0 to 5% increased block chance. Previously, this affected the raising your shield, infuses it with magma duration. So there's a lot of different things that are being changed with this. But fundamentally, the most important thing is just that block is playing an entirely different role to what it played in the past. It's now more reliable and also at the same time, less reliable. It is now a way of mitigating damage, but not something that you can rely upon quite as much for those close range slams, or at least those close range strikes and those close range projectiles. Ultimately, Magma Barrier is one of those things we need to play with in order to feel whether it's any good or not. My intuition says this could be very, very good, but ultimately, whilst a lot of people are talking about how block is worse after these patch notes, I actually think it's probably going to be better because the inability to block close range AoE attacks was really, really severe. And with that being gone, even though some of the numbers that are associated with block are worse than they used to be, I think the mechanic is probably going to feel better overall. And that means the things that trigger off it, like Magma Barrier, or things that are designed to synergize with it, like Magma Barrier, they're potentially going to be better than they'd otherwise be. That said, whilst I am at least feeling reasonably confident the Magma Barrier will be worth using, I am not absolutely certain of this. And this is one of those things where I'm not willing to say you should definitely league start this. This is something to maybe just wait and let the Trailblazers find out whether it's any good or not. It looks good in a vacuum, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily is. Mana Drain, guaranteed by Attuned Wands. This is doing monumentally more damage than it used to. However, at the same time, it's getting less Mana Leech than it used to have. How does this all add up? Well, straight out, it's a buff overall. The decrease in the amount of Mana Leech that you get from it is completely ameliorated by the additional damage that you're getting, and ultimately, this is just much better than it used to be. Mana Remnants now grants a small amount of additional mana compared to what it used to grant, and quality is going to be better as well. Mana Tempest, this is being changed from a level 9 gem down to a level 7 gem. So you get a little bit earlier in the campaign, but it's still fundamentally the same gem. Mantra of Destruction, this is now going to gain less benefit from quality than it used to gain, and this is a substantial decrease. Remember that we said something about how quality, there's a bunch of sources of quality that are being added to the game. Those are going to end up resulting in a bunch of little changes like this. Molten Blast now steps backwards instead of forwards if used while moving in the opposite direction to where you're targeting or while attacking in place. That is something that is both potential quality of life if you're someone who is a very precise player, who is very confident in getting things right, and also something that is going to be infuriating if you're someone who's not paying quite as much attention. Now inflicts 200% more flammability and 100% more ignite duration. The secondary projectile count can no longer be modified. Quality now grants 0 to 30% chance to inflict elemental exposure on hit, previously solely fire exposure. Now, I think this is generally better than it used to be, but there's going to be the odd player who is going to be caught off guard by this new behavior when you're moving in the opposite direction. Right, so let's discuss Orb of Storms next. This is a skill that is going to now trigger in conjunction with a lot of different spells than it used to. This is now able to trigger from casting any spell in its radius. Now, previously, what would trigger it in the past was lightning spells, but Orb of Storms itself had a mistake on it. It would describe itself as triggering off all lightning skills, whether they be spells or not. So something like Lightning Spear, that was not triggering it, but it was telling you it would trigger it, at least if you read the text of Orb of Storms. Nowadays, it's going to be changed so that Fireball, yes, it will trigger it, and also a Lightning Bolt would trigger it, but other things that are skills that are not spells but happen to be lightning attuned, they're not going to trigger it, and you'll know they're not going to trigger it. Now, this is going to create a Lightning Infusion Remnant if every single one of its bolts get used up, or if its duration expires. This is one of those reliable sources of these Lightning Infusion Remnants. As a result, I think I might see a fair bit of use for that purpose. It now has a maximum of 8 bolts at all gem levels. Previously, this was 12 to 29, so a much larger number at various gem levels. It now has a base radius of 360 centimeters, which is an improvement over the old 280. It now deals quite a bit more damage than it used to do, but it now fires a bolt every 4 seconds, and also when you use a lightning skill near the orb. Previously, this was every 3.4 to 2.55 seconds, depending upon the gem level. Now, note that we were just talking about how it was lightning spells and also other spells as well. So it looks like the precise wording that was used here is probably incorrect in the patch notes, and that's something that might get changed in the future. Orb duration is also changing. It was 10 seconds, it is now 12 seconds. All in all, I think that this is a package of improvements that change Orb of Storm for the better, and that this is going to be a more useful skill than it was. It also feels like it's going to be one of the more reliable sources of lightning infusion remnants in order to then pick up those lightning infusions and then feed them into your other skills. And so I feel like you're going to use this on a lot of spellcaster builds. Overwhelming Presence and Withering Presence are now described as aura skills and have the aura tag. There are some changes in the patch notes that are monumental, and then there are some that are very small. This fits the latter category. Perfect Strike. Perfect Strike is getting quite the nerf to the amount of damage that it does, and quite the buff to its damage projection. Melee strike range is being increased from plus 14 to plus 35. Or if you want to talk about that in terms of meters, that is going from 1.4 meters to 3.5 meters. That's pretty substantial, but at the same time, it's going to deal appreciably less damage. Is this overall a net positive for the skill? I feel like it probably is, but that's going to depend upon how comfortable you are with an up-close and personal playstyle. The more comfortable you are with an up-close and personal playstyle, the less benefit that you gain from the improvements to this, but the drawbacks are still just as severe. So ultimately, there's not going to be something all players will agree on. I feel it's a buff, but it is definitely one buff and one nerf combined. Permafrost Bolts. This is now going to have a lot more freeze build-up than it used to have. Previously 80%, this is now going to be 200% at low gem level, 504% at high gem level. However, this is coming at the expense of some damage. The damage on this is getting nerfed quite a bit, but only at higher gem levels. So what's the overall effect here? Well, this is going to be better at inflicting freeze. If you want to inflict freeze on an enemy, then Permafrost Bolts has been buffed substantially. However, if you're wanting to deal damage to enemies, Permafrost Bolts is worse than it used to be. Ultimately, this is now part of more of a combo skill than it used to be. It's definitely something you can use for clear if you've got extraordinary damage and absolutely sublime gear, but if your gear is just mediocre to good, then you'll find that Permafrost Bolts is more of a utility setup. But it is a powerful utility setup, and the utility on it has been buffed. So is this better? Is this worse? I think all in all, the answer is it's just less of a complete package, but it's more of a role player than it used to be. Plasma Blast now has a 50% more magnitude of shock inflicted at the expense of 30% more chance to shock. The projectile is now converting a larger portion of physical damage to lightning damage. So let's start with the good part. Projectile now converting 80% of fizz to lightning instead of 70%. This is a big upside. This means that it is simply more effective to use Plasma Blast on a build that is scaling lightning damage. via other means. However, more magnitude of shock applied is good. More chance to shock being lost is a bit of a drawback, and you're therefore going to end up in this spot where you're probably going to consider this better than it used to be, but it's not going to be better in every single situation. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but this is definitely one of those cases where this is sort of 4 steps forward and 1.5 steps back, maybe 5 steps forward, 2 steps back. The skill is better than it used to be, but there will definitely be niches where that is not the case. Poison Burst Arrow. Change of quality here. This is now going to provide more magnitude of poison inflicted versus increased magnitude of poison inflicted. This is a buff unless you have a very weird setup. Poison Burst Arrow is just getting better as a result of this, and this is going to be scaled even further by the fact that there's a whole bunch of changes that are taking place to the way that poison works generally. Rain of Arrows. Quality is being somewhere between nerfed and gutted. I feel like this is more of a nerf than a gutting, but it's kind of a bit of both. Again, this is one of those things where quality is not being allowed to scale up to extreme levels, but I feel like this is going to end up being quite a bit worse than it was before. Profane Ritual. This is a new change. This was not in the first release of the patch notes. Quality is now going to be halved in effect. Quality now provides 0 to 10% chance to not destroy a consumed corpse, previously 0 to 20%. Again, this is one of those safety valves that's being added in here. This ultimately makes the skill slightly worse than it was previously. Raised Zombie. Quality now provides 0 to 25% increased effective empowerment on raised zombies instead of a more multiplier to minion movement speed. I feel like this is worse almost always than what the old quality was. I feel like this is not a good change in general. Rake is no longer incorrectly tagged as a travel skill. That's kind of odd because it was primarily used as a travel skill. This tag was left over from an earlier version of the skill that traveled much further without a target, whereas the released version of Rake does not meet the criteria for a travel skill. Please note that this was not a balance-motivated change. Consistency is a primary goal of gem tags. It would have nerfed the Rake and Stomping Ground interaction in a different way. It was appropriate for Rake to retain the travel tag. Okay, that's fine. That might be the intention, but ultimately, I feel like this is probably going to be a nerf. What I need to do though here is see what has happened to Stomping Ground, because we don't have those support gems, and ultimately the real powerhouse here was not so much Rake on its own, it was the interaction of Rake in conjunction with Stomping Ground, and without the details of Stomping Ground, we can't talk much about that interaction. Rapid Assault. The spearheads led by the final strike now last for 30 seconds, previously 10 seconds. This is one of those, like, kind of nothing buffs because Path of Exile is a game where everything is fast-paced enough that most things take place in single-digit seconds or in triple-digit milliseconds. Most things do not take place over durations that are much longer than that. As a result, I think that this is one of those buffs that I can confidently say is pretty much a nothing buff. Yes, it is strictly better than it used to be, but not by enough to matter. Rapid Shot no longer has a delay before firing bolts or 50% less reload speed. It now has 100 maximum ammunition on all gem levels, which is a buff, and 30 to 45 maximum heat at various gem levels, which is also a buff. It now deals 37 to 94% of attack damage at various gem levels. This is almost twice as good as it used to be. Quality now grants a bonus to maximum heat that is more than double what it used to be. So everything so far is a substantial improvement. Heat no longer grants a rapid shot damage gained as fire. Instead, reaching maximum heat prevents you from using the skill for 10 seconds. Ouch! It now generates heat once per attack instead of once per 250 milliseconds. Heat now begins decaying after 4 seconds without gaining heat at a rate of 10 heat per second. Heat no longer grants grenade skills damage gained as fire. Instead, Explosive Grenade and Cluster Grenade consume 15 heat to gain 50% of damage as fire damage, while Incendiary Shot consumes 30 heat to gain 50% more ignite magnitude. What we're seeing here is a lot of people have been talking about how some builds feel like they're a bit on rails, where grinding gear games have made certain combinations of skills so good that those individual skills can't be used outside of that bundle. What they're doing here is not quite putting you on rails, but they're putting you in a situation where there's a couple of options that you can take, and you're not quite on rails, but you're definitely in the same ballpark as each other. All of the different options that you could take are basically in the same area, and you can pick one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, mix them together. You've got that degree of freedom, but you can't really pick one from column A and two from column C and have a functioning build. I feel like that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing Rapid Shot being put into a situation where there's only a few other skills you can use it alongside. If you want to use it alongside those skills, you don't need to use any particular one of them, but you need to use a couple from a certain grouping. And then it will provide you with substantial payoffs. But if you're wanting to combine it with things that are entirely different altogether, you're not going to be able to do so. I feel like it's good to have some of these options available in the game, and ultimately, if that ends up being Rapid Shot's role, it's there as something that exists for the person that wants that sort of Wrath of the Lich King era, World of Warcraft type, almost a rotation, but not quite a rotation type setup. Then that's there for those people, and this skill basically doesn't exist for everyone else. Right, so let's talk about roll amount here. This is getting a buff and a nerf, and the intention is that it is a net buff. However, we'll need to run the numbers. There'll be individual cases where that's not the case. This is going to grant 15% increased movement speed while you are mounted. That's the buff. The nerf is that the benefit that it grants you is being decreased from 100% to 80% in all circumstances. So it now grants 80% less movement speed penalty while using skills, which was previously 100%. Now, the intention here is that this is going to cancel out the bonus while you're using a skill, roughly, and ultimately leave you moving at the same speed while you're actively using skills, but slightly faster at other times. However, if you've got an extraordinarily high movement speed, then you might find that this overall is going to make roll amount worse for you. Ripwire Ballista. This is being renamed to Artillery Ballista. Hey, Path of Exile 1 players, do you remember a skill with that name? It now fires a hail of bolts into the air, landing in an area and hitting all enemies within that area a number of times equal to its projectile count. Bolts now fire 4 projectiles, nerfed from 5, and they deal an amount of damage that is tremendously less than what they used to. Bolt's attack speed is now 25% of base, previously 100%, and the Ballista now has a duration of 12 seconds, previously 16 seconds. However, quality now grants an additional 0 to 200% more pin damage, which is a big increase. Ultimately, what we're seeing here is that this looks much worse than what existed in 0.2.0, but there might be things that are not particularly clear here. Ultimately, it looks like it's dealing way less damage, and yes, it's better at inflicting pin than it used to be, but this comes at the expense of basically dealing no damage in comparison to what it used to deal. So, got to see on this one, but my first thoughts on this one are that it is not particularly looking good. Rolling Slam. This now has plus 1500 milliseconds instead of 1000 to total attack time, but it no longer has any attack speed penalty. Quality now provides 0 to 100% increased stun threshold while using the skill, instead of causing days build-up equal to a percentage of the amount of physical damage that is dealt. So what are you looking at here? Ultimately, I can't remember how much the attack speed penalty was on this gem. As a result, I'm not the right person to check on this. What I would do is check this in Path of Building 2 to see if the attack speed is lower than it used to be. If it is, then this skill is worse than it used to be for you with your configuration of gear. If it is faster than it used to be, then this skill is better for you. Scavenge Plating. This is now being changed to no longer have scaling on the amount of armor that it grants. So the old version was 3 to 5% more armor per Scavenge Plating, depending upon the gem level. This is now being fixed at 4%. So essentially, your Scavenge Plating, the amount of armor it grants you is based upon a middling tier roll, or middling tier gem level. It now has 6 to 8 thorns per Scavenge Plating at gem level 4, which is a nerf, and then it is going to scale up to an also nerfed amount. Quality now provides Scavenge Plating duration is longer than it used to be, but ultimately, everything we're seeing with Scavenge Plating looks like it's a pretty bad nerf on its own. However, this is one of those things that needs to be taken in context. There are other changes that are being made to armor. Now, a lot of people are very, very dismissive of armor as a mechanic in Path of Exile 2. There's fairly good reasons for this. It wasn't amazing in 020, but it's worth noting that whilst the English-speaking Path of Exile community considers evasion rating to eclipse armor and energy shield to eclipse both of them, the Chinese language community considers armor to eclipse evasion rating, with energy shield eclipsing both of them. So that's worth keeping in mind. What I think we're seeing is a situation where in 020, actually perhaps armor and evasion were actually reasonably close to each other. There are a number of buffs that are taking place to armor in 030 that are pretty significant. And this is mostly the ability to grant a percentage of your armor to apply to your elemental damage that you suffer. This doesn't seem to be all that good, but a lot of map modifiers cause you to take small amounts of elemental damage, and armor is extremely good at mitigating small hits. So with that in mind, I believe that armor is considerably better in 030 than it was in 020. And as a result, the fact that Scavenge Plating is unequivocally getting nerfed, and this is not a small nerf, it's a moderately bad one, but this is still going to leave it in a reasonably solid place because the mechanic that it relies upon is getting a bunch of buffs as well. Siege Cascade is next. Siege Cascade, Impact is now dealing more damage than it used to, and this is not a small amount more. This is more than 50% more damage than it used to do, while the Explosion is also dealing more damage than it used to. This is not quite scaling by as much. This is scaling by something like 35% more damage than it used to do, but it has a couple of nasties associated with that. No longer deals 200% more damage against immobilized enemies, no longer has a hidden 100% less stun build up against enemies, converts 80% of physical damage to fire damage, or has a payoff and fire gem tags. Payload radius is now 40 centimeters, nerfed from 50 centimeters, while bolt explosion radius is now 80 centimeters, nerfed from 100. The delay between the payload and bolt explosion is now 600 milliseconds, previously 300. So what we're seeing here is a bit more transparency on Siege Cascade. Siege Cascade is doing more damage than it used to in normal play. It's less synergistic with the Tactician Ascendancy because of that immobilized payoff that it used to have. The one that was actually not the one that was not particularly clear because of all the stun build-up mechanics as well. A lot of the convoluted things that existed, these are just not going to be there anymore. Instead, it's just simply going to be less of a combo skill than it used to be. However, I think it's one of those things, this is one of those things that's gone from A+, borderline S- tier in certain situations, and D tier everywhere else. I think it's now being put to like B+ tier everywhere. That seems to be the net impact of these changes. Seismic Cry, cooldown no longer reset if it doesn't empower attacks. Now heavy stuns enemies that are primed for stun, and empowers attacks if it heavy stuns an enemy, if it heavy stuns a target, as well as if it hits a heavily stunned target. Now it empowers 1 slam per 10 monster power in radius. Previously, this was 1 + 1 per endurance charge consumed. No longer has 200% increased knockback distance, which is probably actually good because knockback's one of those mechanics that situationally it's awesome, but most of the time you don't want it. No longer has 400% more stun buildup, ouch, and no longer has hits ignore enemy monster physical damage reduction. Now allows you to expend an endurance charge to bypass the cooldown rather than consuming endurance charges to empower additional attacks. Quality now provides empowered attack aftershocks deal 0 to 10% more damage. Previously it provided Warcry speed instead. So this is one of those things where it's almost a complete redesign of the skill, but ultimately it does still perform most of the same roles that it used to. And one of the key things that's noticeable here is the ability to empower a lot more slams when you're fighting something that is tanky. So if you're in a situation where you're against a one-on-one unique boss fight, well, this is now going to empower 3 slams because inside your radius, you're going to have 20 monster power. Sorry, no, it's going to empower 2 slams. It's going to be the 2 slams because 1 per 10 monster power in radius, and there's going to be 2 of them present. This is no longer going to require endurance charge generation in order to get that extra effect. So Seismic Cry is now going to be better in one-on-one fights against a boss, and probably worse in most really crowded mapping situations. Shield Charge. Shield Charge is one of those things that is just getting a big lot of overhauls. The skill's base movement speed has been nerfed 25%, but it no longer has a cooldown. Now has a base attack time of 600 milliseconds, nerfed from 500, and now deals up to 100% more damage based upon the distance traveled. So in short and sharp bursts don't do very much. Long protracted bursts, they do. Area of Effect now deals 30 to 94% attack damage at gem levels based upon Darius gem levels, which is quite a nerf from what it used to be, even when you factor in that 100% more damage based on distance traveled, while a collision now deals a lot less damage than it used to do as well. Quality now deals an additional bonus of damage based upon the distance traveled, which is probably better than what it used to have. So the key thing here, this is going from something that is used slowly and methodically with a cooldown and in very carefully controlled situations to something that you can spam a little bit more. But when you spam it, it's just not going to be as strong each time that you use it. It's going from something that is more of a precise reward for very tight technical play to something that is more general purpose. Okay, Shield Wall is next. Curvature has been reduced and the wall is now approximately 40% longer by default. Now has a base explosion radius of 4 meters, previously 3 meters, and additionally damages enemies in close proximity to the wall in all directions when exploding. You can now use Shield Charge to bash out through the wall. When the wall is destroyed by your own skills, the entire wall is destroyed at once rather than only nearby segments. However, this can only deal damage to each enemy once. Now has 108 to 235% attack damage at various gem levels. Now this is a nerf from what it used to have, and has 100% more damage if destroyed by your skills. Now if you are destroying this by your skills, this is a massive boost to the amount of damage that it does. However, now deals 80% less damage if destroyed by enemies in the first 500 milliseconds of its duration. Quality now provides 0 to 40% more damage if destroyed by your skills, instead of can have additional shield walls active at a time. Using shield wall with your target location out of line of sight will now cause you to use the skill towards that direction rather than fail. Ultimately, I think this is quite a lot better than it was before, although not in absolutely every imaginable circumstance you can come up with. Basically, this is going to deal more damage more reliably, and it's very much something that you can use on its own just to drop it down and say, all right, I just want the benefit of a shield wall, but most of the time you're going to be using this to deal more damage. You're going to be using this because you're intending to burst right through it with shield charge, or you're intending to burst right through it with something else. So it buys you a few split seconds in order to then set off something else that then triggers a chain reaction. That's the purpose of this skill now. It's much better at it than it used to be. Shockwave rounds. Pulse explosion attack damage has been nerfed by 15%. Shockwave Totem. Slam now has an attack speed that is halved from what it used to be. Slam now deals way less damage than it used to do, while a jagged ground eruption now deals way more damage than it used to do. This no longer has a physical tag. Quality now increases totem duration rather than improving the attack time of the totem. Shockwave Totem cannot itself create jagged ground, and supports no longer apply to Shockwave Totem. My first intuition looking at this is that this feels like it's kind of dead. This feels like a skill that has not just been forgotten about, but actively murdered. This skill looks like it's in a terrible state after these changes. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I am missing something about this, that there's just something I've overlooked, and that someone in the chat comments is going to say, hey, Gog, you're completely wrong about this. This is why Shockwave Totem is still okay. But until that happens, I'm just going to assume Shockwave Totem is now no longer a skill. Siphoning Strike. Shockwave now takes size of monsters into account. Quality now provides a bonus to the chance to daze on hit instead of stun build-up. So you'll see here that stun build-up is something grinding gear games are being a little bit more stingy with, and at the same time, there's more sources of this days on hit mechanic. Ultimately though, this is mostly a nothing change. Skeletal Arsonist. Explosive Demise is now an attack instead of a spell, and it deals 300% of attack damage. In the absence of really detailed stats on minions, I can't really say whether this is better, worse, whether this is fantastic news, or utterly terrible. Now deals an additional fire damage equal to 8% of the minion's maximum life. This was previously 12%, and can now target minions with a certain amount of life or less, which is increased from what it used to be. Ultimately, the mechanics that are behind this are kind of opaque. I can't assess this because we don't know everything else that's going on here. How much of an impact does this change from spell to attack matter? We don't know. All of these things are just unclear, and ultimately that's one of the big problems with minions in both Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 really, but in Path of Exile 1 I think we know a little bit about them, in 2 much less again. Skeletal Brute has a new command skill, Shattering Roar. This is a war cry, it intimidates nearby enemies, and consumes freeze on enemies and allies to deal damage in an area around those targets. Bone Shatter attack now deals 50% more damage on the initial strike, and 100% more damage on the shockwave. Quality is now going to cause twice as much stun buildup as it used to. Ultimately, Skeletal Brute is getting buffed, buffed twice, buffed 3 times, buffed 4 times. It kind of needed it, but this might be one of those skills to watch. One of those examples of a skill that might be taken from dumpster tier to S tier, potentially, if with all these buffs that have taken place to it. Or maybe it's just gone from dumpster tier to B tier. This is the sort of thing playtesting will determine. Skeletal Cleric. Quality now provides revived skeletons are immune to damage for up to 3 seconds after being revived. Now note that that's 3 seconds based on 20 quality. You can potentially get more than that, instead of just having a smaller boost to minion life. Ultimately, I think this is better than it used to be. It's not monumentally better than it used to be, but it's probably better in most circumstances. Skeletal Frost Mage has a new command skill, Ice Armor. This is going to coat minions that are in an area in frost, reducing the damage they take from hits, causing enemies that hit them to take some backlash cold damage, and also to count as frozen for other effects and skills. Quality now provides minions deal an increased amount of damage, or multiplicative amount of damage, instead of reduced reservation. Now we already talked at the start of this video about the way that reservation is changing, but here we've got something where the quality is very, very impactful. Minions dealing more damage is a big deal, and in most cases this is actually going to be superior. So all in all, I think Skeletal Frostmage is getting a lot of buffs here, and this is one of those gems that is on my radar to potentially try. I might even consider league starting this in 030. Skeletal Sniper. The command skill Gas Arrow cooldown is being buffed from 8-second cooldown to 6 seconds. Gas Cloud is now dealing 80% attack damage, which is a buff from 70%, and the quality effect on this now provides minions deal more damage instead of reduced reservation. All in all, I think this is a number of buffs again. It's much smaller than the ones that the Frost Mages got, but it is definitely there. Skeletal Storm Mage. Your command, Deathstorm, is now dealing way more damage than it used to deal, something like 20% more damage than it used to do. And the bolt and shock ground radius is now 2 meters, up from 1.8 in the past. Projectiles now chain 2 times though, nerfed from 2 to 4. This is one of those cases where they're giving with one hand and taking with the other. All in all, I think this is one of those strange cases where actually everything that we said at the start of this video about gem level becoming more central to everything in Path of Exile 2, this is an exception. Skeletal Storm Mage is probably still going to scale a bit with gem level, but not as much as pretty much everything else in the game. So keep that one in mind. This is actually losing some scaling with gem level, but it's also going to be pretty good at all gem levels. Just in some cases better, in some cases worse than it used to be. Snipe. Explosion is no longer guaranteed to be a critical hit and doesn't have increased critical damage bonus. The explosion now deals 936% attack damage at gem level 20, which is a monstrous boost over the old 343%, but that is of course offset by the fact that it's no longer a guaranteed crit, and it has a much bigger base radius. 250 centimeters instead of 160. Perfectly timed arrows that hit a frozen or heavily stunned enemy now cause larger explosions that deal much more damage. Quality boosts the explosion radius. So, Snipe is one of those skills that if you feel you are good at the perfectly timed mechanic, this is going to be a massive payoff for it. You can play this crit if you want, or you can play it non-crit. In the past, you had to play it crit. You had to play it on a build that was investing in critical damage bonus because it was a guaranteed critical hit. Because it's no longer a guaranteed critical hit, you can either play it on a build that is just not investing crits at all, or a build that's going full on crit. Both of them are options. So essentially, Snipe is now going to be more versatile than it used to be, better than it used to be. If you liked this skill in the past, you'll like it more now. If you didn't like this skill in the past, but you felt like it had some cool ideas going on, then it's definitely better. Solar Orb. Solar Orb is being moved from a skill gem onto a staff. It no longer has a mana cost. The Pulse is now going to deal more damage than it used to deal, but not massively more so. And also the Ignites are now going to deal slightly more damage than they used to. But this has all of the consequences that are associated with it being a staff-based skill. So keep that one in mind. This is probably a better skill than it used to be, but it's also something that you no longer get the same way, and you have the big opportunity cost that comes with using a two-handed staff. Sorcery Ward. Now this is a recent change that's been made, and this is one of the skills that is associated with the Witch Hunter Ascendancy. Quality now grants barrier contakes elemental damage up to 0 to 5% of your armor and evasion rating, previously 0 to 10%. So this is being nerfed. Why is this being nerfed when it's not being used that much? It's because there are so many new sources of increased quality that ultimately this is one of those things that could have gotten really scary if it was allowed to get out of hand. Granny Gear Games don't want it getting out of hand, and that's what they're doing here. Spark can now be cold infused to deal a bunch of additional cold damage on top of what it normally does. So if you've got cold infusions from a reliable source, then Spark is going to juice those up further. But ultimately, this is something that requires some investment. And it is the case that Spark is probably not one of the skills you necessarily want to spend cold infusions on, unless Grinding Gear Games have gone out of their way to make the payoff huge. We don't have the hard numbers on this gem, and as a result, we can't say whether this is going to be a worthwhile expenditure source for any of those cold infusions you happen to have. Spear of Solaris, your initial hit is now dealing 29% less damage, while the pulses now deal 50% more damage. The ignited ground now gains up to 100% radius of the ground spear's lifetime, previously 30%, and now deals 67% more damage. Quality is now going to grant a chance to retain 40% of the glory on use, rather than instead providing some sort of magnitude to of ignite bonus. Ultimately, Spear of Solaris is an ultimate finisher. You need to charge this one up for ages, and then when you set it off, it's meant to be a completely epic moment that's meant to completely take over a boss fight. This is not really changing that. It's still going to play exactly the same role, but it's just going to scale with a few different stats to what it used to. Spearfield. Spearfield is now going to deal basically the same damage that it used to do, but it's just going to be more honest about it. Spearfield had an unintentionally hidden 300% more damage after 500 milliseconds. If you've ever used this skill, it felt terrible until sometimes it didn't. Well, this is the reason why. It was terrible a lot of the time. It's just that it didn't tell you it was terrible. Ultimately, this isn't much of a change. The gem is now just going to be more honest with you about the amount of damage that it's dealing. It's slightly better in some situations, very slightly worse in others, but ultimately it's doing a roughly quadruple and a quarter the damage it used to do, but it's losing out on this quadruple factor. And then at the same time, it's also dealing 20% less damage in that first 500 milliseconds that it exists. So all in all, a little bit more damage if it's been out for at least 500 milliseconds, a little bit less if it's been out for less than that, but not any big changes, still within 10% either way. Stormwave now additionally hits targets slightly to either side of your character. I feel like this is going to be huge for this skill. This is one, though, that requires some playtesting to work out exactly what the collision radius is on that. Stormblast Bolts is next here. Everything is getting buffed here. This needed it. Everything here is positive. Nothing is negative. It's going to deal more damage and it's going to have more duration as well. So all in all, pretty significant buff here. Whether this is enough to fix this skill or not is an open question. Sunder. Sunder is in an interesting spot here where it is no longer going to have a 900 millisecond total increase to attack time, but its attack speed is getting nerfed from 65% base to 35% base. So what this means is that the better your attack speed is, the better Sunder is going to be, and that's not going to be quite as extremely throttled as it was in the past. So ultimately, Sunder is now just scaling more with attack speed than it used to. It's also getting a number of other important changes as well. No longer consuming fully broken armor to guarantee a critical hit. Instead, it inflicts sundered armor on fully armored broken targets, inflicting an additional 20% increased physical damage taken for a duration. So it is going to deal less instant application damage when it strikes an enemy, but it is going to result in a decrease to that enemy's ability to take damage for a period of time. All in all, this one is hard to assess. I think you will find Sunder is probably better at high gear level and probably worse at low gear level, but ultimately this needs to be played with to be certain about this. Also, adjust the damaging area to more closely match the visual effects. Is this good? Is this bad? This one is hard to tell for certain. Supercharged Slam. This is going to deal more damage than it used to do, even though it's only getting 40% scaling with each additional stage, whereas it used to grant 60%. It is still unconditionally better, even considering that. Quality is being nerfed, but ultimately this is coming out ahead. This is definitely a better gem than it used to be. Tempest Bell. Tempest Bell is changing its quality, and this is going to be one of those things that's probably maybe even a little bit worse than it used to be, but better in some situations, worse in others. Quality is now providing 0 to 3% more damage per hit the active bell has taken, instead of the bell being destroyed after 0 to 2 hits. Again though, this is one of those things where quality is being nerfed a little bit in some places, or at least wherever it might have potentially super linear scaling, it's being nerfed back to linear scaling here. That's one of the key things that's happening in order to allow some of the quality scaling that's being added to the tree. Is this a positive change overall? I'm honestly not sure, but it's something Path of Exile 1 has had as well. Really quite a way back with Enhanced being added. They've changed the identity of quality a number of times in Path of Exile 1, but ultimately they've found it in a situation where now they don't really have very many effects where there's super linear scaling on it. Temporal Chains. This is now available earlier than it used to be, and it is getting a buff. However, this buff is then getting addressed also by those curse changes we talked about earlier. So ultimately, this is a net buff, but not a massive net buff. It looks massive when you look at these numbers, but ultimately it is just a slight buff overall, because 50% reduced effective curses on tougher enemies, that is not going to apply. So that's going to be a new thing that applies, and it's going to pull it back to being basically where it was in 020. However, what Temporal Chains is going to do is it's going to be staggeringly boosted the rare times that you use it on weaker enemies. So do keep that one in mind. Thunderous Sleep. Quality now provides a chance to leave shocked ground when detonating spears. This replaces its old effect. Is this better? Is this worse? It's probably about the same as it used to be. Sometimes it'll be better, sometimes it'll be worse, but ultimately I think it's roughly about equal. Time of Need. This is being changed to now require some intelligence at the expense of less strength. This is almost always a buff, almost always, but I'm not willing to call it absolutely always a buff. Depends upon the build you're playing. Toxic Growth. And for some reason, I keep going to say Chocolate Growth there. I have no idea why I have that sort of inspiration jump into my head, but Chocolate Growth. Pustules now deal 46 to 100% of attack damage, which is a huge buff from the old 42% at all gem levels. Now it is a range skill and no longer causes you to leap into the air on use. Now has a barrageable tag. No longer has 700 milliseconds increase to attack time, and now it has an attack speed of 80% of base. I feel like, unless I'm missing something, this is enormously being buffed. I feel like pretty much every single one of those lines is a big improvement, and that ultimately this is looking much better, but I could be missing something here. So if I am missing something, let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, chocolate growth looks like it's being substantially improved. Trinity. This is now going to apply to all elemental damage, not just elemental attack damage. Quality is now going to grant skill speed instead of attack speed. It is now a Dex Int hybrid skill instead of pure dexterity. Look, this is just out of sight better than it used to be. This is something that probably needed the buff, but it is getting out of sight boosted, and this is definitely there to empower that tri-element playstyle that they've talked about a little bit, and that wasn't, like, it was technically possible to do previously, but now they're going out of their way to provide tools for it. This was something that you could do as a tri-element playstyle with attack builds in the past, but Trinity wasn't enough of a payoff for them. Now, maybe it's enough of a payoff when you're playing a build that is dealing elemental damage with spells. Unearth can now be used on dead skeletal reviving minions once per death to create a bone construct. Note that very important text, once per death. Bone constructs created by Unearth now have a dash attack that they can use to close the gap to an enemy. Quality now increases bone construct movement speed. This description has been updated to indicate that larger corpses can create more than one bone construct. Vaulting Impact. This now allows you to jump over enemies and small amounts of terrain. To support this, a number of changes to camera movement have been made that result in smoother camera movement during skills. Let's hope they get that right, because if they get that wrong, slightly wrong, it's going to be jarring, and if they get that glaringly wrong, then it's going to be motion sickness inducing. Now, this deals a very small amount more damage than it used to do, with more of an impact at lower gem level. Now it escalates days, causing a portion of the damage that is dealt by Vaulting Impact to be taken by all sequential hits until days expires. Quality now provides Broken Stance has 0 to 2 second duration, or until days is removed. Previously, 0 to 20% chance to cause an aftershock. Like, this is out of sight better. This is one of the biggest improvements that we've seen on all of these skills, and this is basically line after line of improvement. This is far better than it used to be. Volcanic Fissure. This now creates two branches that emerge from either side of the main fissure. The main length of the fissure is now affected by area modifiers. This now has a slightly lower minimum gem level, 7 instead of 9, so you still get it in Act 2, but you get it earlier in Act 2 than you otherwise would have. 80% fizz damage converted to fire rather than 60%. Remember, the higher that number gets, the better. It's reasonably hard to fill that out. This is not Path of Exile 1, where you can just use Exarch gloves to easily get the rest. This is actually quite a bit harder. And it now deals 145% attack damage at gem level 20, which used to be 163%. So that component of it is worse. Aftershocks cannot trigger more than once every 200 milliseconds. Quality now provides 20% chance to cause an aftershock instead of 4 seconds to fissure duration. Allied slams now trigger volcanic fissures, which is cool, but probably doesn't matter very much in most players. And retriggers are now treated as aftershocks and will scale with aftershock specific effects. So there's a few things in there that allow you to build combos in very specific situations, but ultimately this is probably slightly worse than it used to be. Despite the fact that most lines of these changes were good, the most important one is 163% of attack damage getting nerfed to 145%, and based upon that, I feel like it's probably worse overall. It will, however, depend upon how well you're able to use those fissures, and then to use your own skills to trigger those particular fissures later on. If you're really good at that, then you might find that this is actually better because you've got these additional aftershocks that are coming. There's a lot of other stuff that's going on there. Right, so let's talk Voltaic Grenade and let's get an F in chat for this one. This seems like every line here feels like it's good except for one. However, that is just not what's going on. So let's look at what's going on here. Now applies the electrocution debuff to enemies on hit for 6 seconds, and now has 210 to 340% more electrocution buildup from hits with this skill at gem levels 7 to 20. Previously, this was only 50% at all gem levels. Hey, everything here sounds really great, doesn't it? But, now has 327% attack damage at gem level 20, a nerf from 714%. So, how much electrocution were you inflicting in the past? Well, it was something like a 1070% because you had 714% attack damage plus 50% more. Well, guess what? That part is actually going to get better. You're going to do 327% damage, and that's going to be multiplied by almost 4.5. That's going to be something of the order of maybe 15 times the amount of electrocution damage, scaled up from 10 and a bit. The problem is, the amount of damage you're doing is miles down. Essentially, Voltaic Grenade is now much more of a stun grenade. It still does some damage, but it deals a lot less damage than it used to do, and the amount of additional electrocution chance that you get really doesn't make up for that in most situations. Vulnerability. This is getting a monumental buff. This is now going to be exactly twice as good as it used to be. It is going from nerfing enemy armor by 9,605 to 19,210. This, however, is then going to be offset entirely by those changes to curses. So against unique enemies, vulnerability is exactly what it used to be. Against weaker enemies, however, vulnerability is going to be better than it used to be. So this is a buff, but whilst the numbers here look spectacular, the real numbers are not spectacular. They're just okay. It is a buff, but it's not the spectacular buff it looks like. War Banner. Aura now grants 25% more attack damage, previously 5 to 6%, 50% increased accuracy rating, previously 30%, and now also grants 25% increased attack speed. Wow, this looks fantastic. But remember, all of the banner mechanics are being changed, and banners are going to be harder to plant. Now it has a duration of 6.6 to 9.8 seconds at various gem levels, so this is a substantial buff, and the banner is no longer removed when you leave the aura. Quality is now going to improve reservation efficiency. Previously, it was something else. So what we're seeing here is something that looks absolutely fantastic until you consider that some of the scaling that existed under the old Valor system is gone entirely. Is this going to be a worthwhile banner to drop? Yes. Is it necessarily better than what it used to be? No. Is it something I can confidently say, yes, this is buffed, or no, this has been nerfed? Actually, it's kind of neither. I do think, though, it will still have a place. This feels like it is still a solid skill, as is the case with all of the other banners. They all look like they're good. Wave of Frost is gaining one new line of text that probably doesn't matter all that much, but will occasionally be good. It now freezes enemies that are already primed for freeze. Bonus, yes. Important, not really, because most of the things that would prime something for freeze are also going to have already inflicted freeze. Whirling Slash. Movement is now able to pathfind slightly, making it less likely to get stuck on small obstacles. This sounds fantastic, but I'm not convinced until I've actually tried it. Is this the improvement this skill needs? I'm not sure. Whirlwind Lance. Collapsing Whirlwind now deals 20% more damage. Whirlwinds created by Whirlwind Lance now have a limit of 6 whirlwinds, previously 5, and a duration of 15 seconds, previously 8. So this is 3 buffs all in one. This is really substantial, and I feel like Whirlwind Lance was already in a at least serviceable spot, so this is the sort of thing that could take something from serviceable to good, or maybe even from serviceable to great. Wind Serpent's Fury no longer causes shockwaves when enemies are hit into walls or into larger enemies. Quality now provides knockback distance instead of increased knockback distance, so it's more knockback instead of increased knockback. This is mostly a series of nothing changes here, except for the situation where enemies are hit into walls or larger enemies. Sometimes that's going to come up, and that's going to feel worse than it used to. This is one where I'd need to play around with the skill more to be certain on this, but I feel like this is mostly negative. The other thing that's frustrating is just having more knockback distance. Sometimes the ability to knock an enemy back can be useful, but you actually kind of want to minimize how far you knock them back sometimes, because knocking them back can break them out of a skill, or it can cause something they're using on you to miss. But if you knock them back too far, then you might knock them out of your own skills. Generally, player skills have more range than enemy ones do, and so knockback can be quite useful, but knockback taken to extremes ends up generally being pretty negative. So I'm not sold on this package of changes. I don't think this is necessarily an improvement. Wind Blast. Now dazes on hit, instead of causing daze build up equal to a percentage of Fizz damage dealt. Quality now provides 0 to 20% more damage to enemies within 150 centimeters of you, scaling down to no bonus at 4 meters or further away. Now previously this was knockback distance. Ultimately, I think that anything instead of knockback distance is probably an improvement, and given that this is conditional more damage, it's likely to be better than it was. After that, there's some clarifications. These aren't intended to be balance changes per se, so much as rectifying issues where what was written on the gem was not exactly what was going on. There have been a couple of these already mentioned earlier, but these are ones where nothing else was changing in the gem. Updated the description for Raging Spirits to clarify the Flaming Skulls do not follow player commands. They're too busy raging. Clarified the addition to radius per stage for Whirling Slash and Whirlwind Lance skill descriptions. Updated the wording and presentation for Plague Bearer to be more simplified. Gotta say, Plague Bearer is one of those skills that is just so complicated when you read it. It's really hard to parse exactly what it does, so hopefully they've gotten that right. And updated the description for Thunderous Leap to mention that it detonates spear skills. After this, we're going to jump into unique item changes, which is the remaining thing we're going to cover in this part 2 of the video. After that, part 3 is going to cover everything else. Bearer's Anguish. Now, this is interesting. This unique charm had some pretty significant bugs in 020. Specifically, for a whole period of time, it always crit. Anyways, it's been completely reworked. It's now going to create bad ground instead of setting enemies on fire. What does this mean? This means that those enemies that are close by to you, they're now going to leave bad ground underneath them, which is quite different to setting every enemy on fire and having that fire follow those enemies until that fire expires. Basically, Bearer's Anguish is going to be a lot worse in 030 than it was in 020, and some of the builds that existed around it in 020 are probably utterly dead. And that includes the builds that would have been dead even if they fixed the bug where it always crit. Now, one thing we're going to notice here is that a lot of things are going to have modifiers that apply to block chance later. We'll come to that in a bit, but just remember, keep in mind those changes we discussed earlier about how block as a mechanic is being overhauled. Block is no longer the mechanic it used to be. It is now possible to block things that are not strikes and that are not projectiles. So you can block things like slams, you can block things like AoE abilities, but at the same time, maximum block chance has been nerfed. What this means is that there's a little bit less of a requirement to get large amounts of block on gear, and block is better except if you invest really hard into it. So keep that one in mind, because a lot of things in this unique item section is going to be related to block. That said, this one is not. The Blackblade unique body armor used to have 100% of armor applies to elemental damage. This is being boosted to 100 to 150%. Existing versions of this item can be made better or worse with the Divine Orb. I actually don't see how you could make it worse. I feel like this is always going to be better. One of the problems though, this stat is really good. This stat is better than people give it credit for, but, and this is important, it needs to be on armor that has quite a bit of armor on it. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where you've got lots of rewards for using more armor, but you just don't have that armor in order to get that going. The Bones of Ula unique boots now provide 20 to 30% reservation efficiency for skills that create undead minions, instead of undead minions having 20% reduced reservation. Now, when you read this, you're going to think, hey, that's a buff. Actually, no. No, that is not a buff. This is actually probably a nerf, and that's because reduced reservation is just inherently more powerful than reservation efficiency is. Reservation efficiency is one of those things that's just a safer stat, because it's one of those things that just can't scale as much. Now, it is the case that if the only sources of reservation efficiency you've got are on your boots, then 26 to 30% is actually going to be better than 20% reduced reservation was. However, as you start getting more of this stat elsewhere, there'd be an escalating returns effect on reduced reservation that does not apply to reservation efficiency increases. That said, whilst Bones of Ula's other stats are getting worse, the increased movement speed is very welcome. It's kind of not very much of it, and as a result, I still don't see that many people using these sets of boots. Brisk Wrap is now going to grant you deflection rating equal to 20 to 30% of evasion rating. Deflection is a new mechanic that will come in when we get into part 3. Deflection is huge. Where I've been talking about how on the left-hand side of the tree, getting your armor added to elemental damage at various percentages, while I think this is a reasonably good mechanic and other people think it is a meh mechanic, everyone agrees that deflection rating is potentially very, very strong. What deflection is something that allows you to sort of layer it on top of evasion, and it takes the edge off hits. It's an additional defensive layer that allows you to take only 60% of damage from a hit that you fail to evade. So Brisk Wrap is getting much better than it used to be, because every source of deflection rating is going to be useful. Now, Death's Harp unique bow is getting nerfed, and this is going to be something we're going to see a lot of. Unique items that grant critical damage bonus, which for those of you that also play Path of Exile 1, the equivalent stat there is critical damage multiplier. All sorts of sources of crit multi are getting nerfed, and this is just one of those examples. It's going from 30 to 40% down to 20 to 25%. Most sources of crit multi that you can get, or critical damage bonus to use the POE2 term, these are getting nerfed by approximately a 40% less multiplier. The Effigy of Cruelty unique focus now has critical hits with spells apply only 1 to 3 stacks of crit weakness instead of 3 to 5. Again, you'll see this is one of those things where Grinding Gear Games are trying to push people away from crit is numerically the best option, therefore you either play crit or don't bother, into you can play crit or you can play non-crit. The thing is that this is all being done, or pretty much all being done, by reducing the power of crit builds rather than providing some rewards to people who are playing non-crit setups. Malgaro's Virtuosity, oh yes, guess what? These are getting nerfed. These are going to go from 300% to 250%. This doesn't give you a critical damage boost. This is not crit multi in the traditional sense. This overwrites your entire character's crit multi. So it just says, okay, we don't care what gear you've got. We don't care what passive tree investment you've made. All of that's irrelevant. Your crit multi is 250%, or previously 300%. Interestingly, this is also going to apply to legacy versions of this item that might have existed in standard. Nazir's Judgment unique quarterstaff now has days on hit instead of causes days build up equal to 100% of damage dealt. That feels like a nothing change. It now also deals increased melee damage against stunned enemies. That is not a nothing change, but it's not enough to make this stuff good. Briar's Embrace unique body armor now provides 20 to 40% increased mana cost efficiency instead of 20% reduced mana cost of skills. This does not change existing versions of this item. So here again, we have this efficiency concept where Grinding Gear Games are going out of their way to make it so that there is a payoff for getting a small amount of an effect, but that it doesn't quite scale up as much as it would otherwise once you start getting an enormous amount of that effect. The Quadral's Molt unique body armor is now getting some deflection bonus. This is far better than it used to be. Tangletongue, however, is taking a nerf that everyone saw coming. Instead of 10 to 20%, this is now going to be nerfed to 5 to 8% base crit. This probably actually doesn't kill the item, but it takes it from almost upper endgame gear down to being something that's just kind of good, but not absolutely and utterly bonkers. The Whispering Ice unique staffs inflict cold exposure on hit, lowering cold resistance by 20 to 30% modifier, now applies universal unconditional elemental exposure instead. And that's the same for Zoph's Blood. This time, instead of enemies in your presence having fire exposure, this is going to be unconditional elemental exposure. Now we have an interesting one. A number of unique items are taking a break from the game. These are Inferno Clasp. This is the belt that provides a whole bunch of fire resistance and maximum fire resistance. Forbidden Gaze, Thunderstep, the Wailing Wall, the Fallen Formation, a Wailing Stake, the Deepest Tower. This is the one that has the tremendously strong effect that enemies that are within your presence are treated as being on low life, and the Remembered Tales. So really, two of these are a real loss for the way that people were going to go around building gear and building gear sets and building characters. The Deepest Tower in particular is a huge loss for people who are playing in the south area of the passive tree, because there was a lot of really strong conditional damage on enemies being on low life. The Deepest Tower was the best way to enable. That said, maybe this is being done because Grinding Gear Games felt like the Deepest Tower was putting limits on how much they could boost that. Now, here we have all of the block chance changes. This is a whole chunk of unique shields. We're just quickly going to go through all of them. Red Blade Banner unique shield, this is having its block chance halved. Like Lycosidé, this is having its block chance roughly cut in 3. Merit of Service, this is having its block chance slightly better than halved. The Alchem Ira unique shield, this is being halved in block chance. Oaksworn, halved. Dunkelholt, better than halved. Blood Barrier, halved. And Doomgate. Doomgate, however, is actually getting buffed on one roll and then nerfed on another. Now, it's important to note here that everything that we said about what was happening with block in general is very important to take in combination with all of these changes. You don't need as much percentage increased block chance as you used to, and also the payoff for reaching the block cap is in some ways better, in some ways worse than it used to be. Ultimately, I feel like block is probably a stronger mechanic overall in 030, but it's not stronger in every situation. It's going to be stronger against just a general cross-section of the enemies in the game, but there will be certainly some enemies that it is weaker against. And ultimately, that is going to be the end of part 2 of going through all of these patch notes. Part 3 still has a lot to go through. We have a bunch of additional item changes, and there's a lot of little ones there. There's monster changes, which actually are some of the biggest changes in the entire thing. Quest changes, UI changes, MTX changes, these are pretty minimal. Bug fixes, which are one of those things that I need to go through very carefully and look for any of the ones that have an impact on the way that the game is played. And then after that, there's also a number of just generic player changes. These player changes include some big things. This is the details of the block stuff. That the reason that I did these in the order that I did them is because I wanted to go through the context of some of the item changes first, then come back to that, and also go through some of the skill changes, and then bring up these player changes sections. And most importantly of all, for part 3 is going to be all the changes to the ascendancies. What we're missing though is passive skill tree changes. Yes, we have a small amount of them here, but there is a lot more. There are 23 new clusters in the mercenary area of the passive tree alone, and there's 25 in the witch sorceress areas of the passive tree. So basically, there is a lot to cover there. I'm hopefully, no promises, going to get that out in the next 36 hours. But let's leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.